Hello, everybody, and welcome to 6 Pixels Under. This is our third episode. I am Nerd Slayer, your host, and this week we will be talking about a couple of things, but of course, probably the one that we have to get out of the way first is the unfortunate, technically not a passing yet, but inevitable passing of Telltale and their game studio. They had to I think they had to let off basically 90% of their workforce. So that's the first topic we're going to get into immediately is the death of Telltale Studio. Sorry, I'm so eager to get started today. But everybody, welcome to the chat. Happy to see you guys again. And for those who are joining us after, I hope you enjoy the rest of this podcast. Also, to point out to everybody, in conjunction with the next news assignment, let's do our transition. I always forget which one is it. Oh, it's this one. There you go. For the people who are just listening, they're probably always like, what on earth are you guys talking about? Okay, let me pull up the image really quickly. Can't remember what it is. Oh, there it is. We're esports. We're doing it live. There's no worries. But yeah, let's get to it, right? It's sad. And why did Jim Sterling have such a mean-sounding video today talking about Telltale and whatever else? Anyway, the first topic of the day is the death of Telltale Studio. And I'm sure everybody has read it at this point. It's pretty sad. I'll pull the article up on screen for those who haven't. And we can talk about it a little bit more. So essentially the story is, as far as we know, apparently Telltale is going to be closing the majority of their studio. As far as we know, it's going to be basically like 90-something%. They're going from 400 down to like 25 people or something of the sort. And that last 25 people are basically going to be working on what's called like, you know, the skeleton crew or whatever is going to be working on the Minecraft story, the rest of the Minecraft story. I think that's like episode 2 or whatever else at this point. And man, this news was kind of just, I don't know about you guys, but this was totally random for me. This was totally random. I did not see this coming at all. This was kind of one of those things where you knew of Telltale at this point, and you knew of the kind of games that they could create. And certainly, I think it should be pointed out that although people will certainly probably remember them for their repetitive episodic format, I think that was working up until it wasn't, if that makes sense. So if you look at their early games, especially in games like, I had no idea, guys, that they are actually the ones behind bringing back Sam & Max. I had no clue about that. Somebody pointed that out in Discord, and I was like, man, I used to see CSI and Sam & Max, those sorts of games. I used to see them in like the value bins. You guys remember back when you would go to like Walmart or something like that, and then they would have like those little bins where it'd be like $5 and you get 2 games or you get 1 game or whatever, and it would be like all these cool boxes. I remember seeing like Sam & Max and like CSI and these things, and I was like, wow, like never heard of these games before. This looks interesting. And yeah, they were doing Sam & Max games like 12 years ago or something at this point. Like, no, maybe 10 years ago, a while ago. And then of course everybody remembers them for their probably most successful launch, and that was The Walking Dead Season 1. And then Wolf Among Us. Although it's rather hyped, I don't want to say it's nearly as popular as The Walking Dead or the Tales from the Borderlands episodes. Hey, what's up, everybody in chat? Sorry, I didn't say hi to you guys. But yeah, like seeing Sam & Max on that docket, man, that makes me sad, because that's just one of those games, frankly speaking, that's never going to get the love that it deserves. The love and I mean, it's just Telltale in general. Once again, I think people are going to remember the episodic format, which again it ended up being a flaw to some extent. But there's good news, and the good news is that I'm going to tell the story of Telltale. So, you know, rejoice, everybody. For those who care, I will be doing a Death of a Game episode on Telltale. So I think I will have to refrain from saying Telltale over and over again and have to say Telltale so it sounds a little bit clearer to you guys. But I'm excited to tell the story. I think that there's so much story behind this because if you've been following this story, or at least like from afar, know a little bit about Telltale and kind of their woes, their financial woes, this has been ongoing for a number of years. Apparently, they've never been off like particularly well financially, and some of that has to do with the fact that they actually self-publish themselves on nearly everything except I think one game or something like that. So they were not a typical development studio. They were in-house publishing their own products. But anyway, they've had rumors about mismanagement. They've had rumors about one of their co-founders kind of being a dick to the creatives. If you guys remember in the very beginning, they actually lost 2 or 3 of their major writers after their first episode of Walking Dead. So they've had issues, certainly, and it's definitely they've always been in danger. I mean, just last year, if I remember correctly, they laid off a lot of people. I think it might have been like 100, maybe 200 people. Point being, it's been a while that they've been suffering from issues, but it's still shocking to see, and it still sucks to see it, because me personally, The Wolf Among Us is one of the best, I guess you would call it, story episodic, graphical adventures. I don't know what you would even call those sorts of games. They're kind of like movies. They're kind of like TV shows, kind of like interactive games. They remind me of like the build your own, or choose your own story books. Where that felt like you were kind of playing a game to some extent. That's what Telltale has always kind of reminded me of. But it's sad to see, and I'm not going to get too much into it because I'm going to be doing a video on it. I can promise you guys this, that it's going to be awesome. I have so much that I've already found, and so much that I want to talk about in regards to them as a studio, but also just their legacy, and a legacy that I hope doesn't get forgotten. So I think we're ready to move on to the next topic, and that is loot boxes are back on the docket, right? Yeah, we're not tired of talking about loot boxes yet. There's been some new cool stuff. For those who don't remember last week's podcast, we talked about loot boxes in regards to the Belgium government, and EA was going to go head to head with them. Well, there's been some more developments. Apparently, the Australian Parliament is saying that loot boxes provide game companies with an unregulated way of exploiting gambling disorders. And so I found that this was actually going to be an interesting topic that we can have here, simply because I don't know if you guys are aware of this, and I don't know how much this is the public opinion at this point, but I've actually had some people disagree with me. And now let me rephrase. I didn't make any necessarily strong point. I just pointed out kind of passively that government involvement will ultimately force these large companies to make good decisions, or make good decisions as it relates to the community or the society. And I had some comments last week where people kind of took what I would like to call like a libertarian stance, which, I'm not a very political person. In fact, I would even say mostly apolitical, especially with my content. I try and keep that separate. But just for people who aren't aware of kind of like the concept is that the free market or the economy will kind of always fix itself. So whenever players don't want something, they'll just don't want it loud enough with their checkbooks, aka they won't pay for it, and the market will just kind of change on its own. Well, this is kind of going to be one of my big topics of today. I didn't really have a counterpoint segment set up today. I did have some a subject that I wanted to talk about in particular over that segment. But anyway, so what I found with this argument is that it's just, first off, it ignores the fact that there's already been research and studies done, and not to mention there's been many instances within our culture, our history, of humans proving that we're unable to say no to things. Humans have always had issues, including me in particular, and I'll explain that in a second, have had issues with addiction, addictive substances, addictive habits, addictive mental states, depression, that sort of thing. That's been going on for now a couple dozen of years. And people think that by not having the government make, maybe in this case, big corporations have to curtail some of their loot box practices, that's going to somehow end up in some like cascading effect where now the government's going to take all the rights away from people. That's kind of usually the argument that people start to make. And so let me refute that. First off, it's been proven within gambling itself, even that this is the case, that the government kind of has to get involved. And that's been proven, again, you go to Las Vegas or some places like that, you can basically only gamble in certain areas on certain reservations. And gambling is very limited in America, very limited, especially if you're from the UK. And that's for a particular reason. It sucks for the poker players, or especially the professional ones. I used to know a couple. But it's there because addictive habits such as gambling can basically destroy somebody's life or destroy their possible career. So in the case of like an online loot boxes in an MMO or microtransactions in an MMO, the reason why these strike people so negatively is that they understand that these can really have negative implications on the market itself. And it's absolutely correct. I mean, first off, we've talked about this last week. In regards to the MMORPG market right now, it's kind of a little bit dry. There's not a whole lot of variety, and the variety that does exist has such a meaning, or like a minuscule existence. It doesn't have a very large population. Point being, the market's a little bit stale, right? Well, when the market is kind of stale, I think developers and publishers can get away with a lot more bad business practices. And I should specify good business practices for them, bad for the consumer. But I feel like that's kind of where the developer or the publisher, in this case, like someone like Pearl Abyss, for example, they just kind of proved this recently, they can get away with a lot more. And that's because public opinion, whenever you're in a drought, right, is going to be warped to some extent. So whenever you're just wanting a good MMO period, you're willing to kind of ignore my.com, or you're willing to ignore the loot boxes or the microtransactions. You're kind of willing to get rid, and not to mention, once you start to get involved into like the human psyche and like your love and desire to do certain things, then you start to play with things like addiction and like the neuron pathways that affect the way you react to certain stimuli or whatever else. Not to get all super nerdy on you guys, but point being, addiction is a very, very real thing. And the reason why I mentioned what I was saying earlier is actually because I personally am somebody that deals with addictive tendencies, and these go in my family. My mother was an alcoholic. Alcoholism runs in the family. I know, very shocking to some people, but addictive tendencies, they run in my family. There's a reason why this little kid, when I used to be a youngling, could never really enjoy things in the same way that other kids could, because it was always, I had to play them to the absolute end of their spectrum. And then you end up hating them after that point. Or try and beat a video game as like fast as you possibly can. Anyway, I've always been somebody that's suffered from addictive tendencies. And so when I see people kind of making these like libertarian arguments in the sense of like, oh, well, the market will just solve itself, like the government doesn't need to step in regards to loot boxes, guys, that's just not true. Like, microtransactions have been around now for, I would say, about 11 to 12 years based on my research, give or take. Again, we don't know exactly who piloted it, but we're pretty sure it's Nexon, at least like Western, like in the Western hemisphere, sorry. I'm pretty sure Nexon, we would probably say, in terms of like their American products, definitely kind of made microtransactions a big deal. And you also saw that with Perfect World, I should say, too. PWI, Perfect World Entertainment, or was it International? It's International. That's what their company's name. I think the game's named the same thing. But anyway, as somebody who went through this myself, I used to play video games, and there was this game called Habbo Hotel. And this is a funny story to tell you guys, but it was basically a chat website kind of game that actually had casinos in the game. And so in this game, I used to just bet constantly at the casino. I was like 11 years old, guys. One of my first MMOs was like this like social MMO, Habbo Hotel, and I used to see my 11-year-old ass sitting in the booth, or right in the dealer chair, across from the dealer chair, sitting at the booth, wanting to play blackjack. And that's what I would do most of my day. I would go off, make currency in the game. Furniture, they used to call it, was kind of like your main currency. And I used to just constantly bet. And I'm this 11-year-old kid just betting. Now imagine that, but imagine it's loot boxes, and it's in nearly every multiplayer game, and it's in nearly every MMO, and it's in nearly every AAA like shooter. I mean, how do you not have issues with someone like me, this addictive mind, wanting to just go in and do it over and over again and mess with it. But anyway, I just bring that story up to let you guys know that there are people who suffer from these things, and the science also backs me up, not just my anecdote, because first off, never take someone's anecdote as like the sole way to address a situation or to analyze a situation. To bring in the statistics, I will link this. Let me see if I can. I don't know if I can actually link this, but I will show it to you guys. There is a study that was done in the Reddit thread that actually calls out the loot boxes. I'll show it on screen in just a second. Okay, so it should be loading. Okay, so there's a study right here, and again, the full report link is right here. I will link this in chat just in case people want to double. You had a HC couch? Those were rare, dude. I remember those, Ludin. Sorry. I forgot if I left it. Did I leave the chat on today? Yes, I did. Okay, you guys are... The YouTubers are seeing what I said. Anyway, so here's the study. It was done over 7,422 people, and they found important links between loot box spending and the problem gambling. So the bullet points are essentially that loot boxes acted as a gateway to problem gambling amongst gamers. Loot boxes provided game companies with an unregulated way of exploiting gambling disorders amongst their customers. So given the relationship, basically what the study recommends is that games containing loot boxes carry parental advisories, which, by the way, is a very, very simple and basic concept that actually helps out tremendously. And you can see this in regards to... if you look at loot boxes in certain games, for example, they're very careful to be like, oh, it contains one of these, only one of these. Like, they really try and painstakingly like explain to you what the loot box is, so you can kind of not get away with the excuse that Facebook or Microsoft, I should say Facebook or Apple fans used to say. Or players or customers used to say, which is kind of like, well, my kid had no idea, they just pressed one button and they bought a microtransaction. That was a big problem on mobile devices. Well, obviously it's a problem on the internet too. But we don't have the same parental advisories that we now have on the phone. On the phone now, that's why Apple actually switched to the whole Get thing instead of download or whatever it was, or free that it used to say, was because people were buying these games that were free, quote unquote, that had immense amounts of microtransactions. Anyway, so this is the study that they did, and obviously I would say that this is a pretty good study size, a sample size of 7,000 people. And you're going to talk about the psychological claims and links between gambling and loot boxes. This is kind of like what I would describe as like a layup conversation, right? It's fairly obvious. This doesn't take a lot of like analysis per se to understand the point that, sorry, I was switching back to the other one. To understand the point that there's a problem here. So that's all I have to say about that. I just wanted to bring it up again because look, there's been more developments. The Australian Parliament, as I said, the Parliament Committee, which is like a strange name, but they think that it's a serious issue. So you're starting to see movement across the globe. People are realizing the dangers of this system. And frankly, I'm just happy to see it. Ultimately speaking, if the free market always solved everything and we didn't need any government interaction or involvement, there wouldn't have ever been things like monopoly. There wouldn't have ever been things like the steel industry. There wouldn't have ever been things like, I don't know, gambling, just regular gambling. But I digress, and I won't belabor that point any further. Let's move to my next topic, which is going to be a short topic, but it's a sad one. And that's, have you guys heard the news about famed orchestric, what would you even call him? A mogul, maestro? At this point, I don't know, but we're talking about Nobuo Uematsu, and I hope I pronounced that well. But he's taking an extended leave of absence due to fatigue, and this seems like a random topic for some. But this is a big deal for me, okay? Because I really like Nobuo's work. I think he's fantastic. It's the composer for Final Fantasy. Yes, it is, MGPT. It's sad, man. It's sad to see a legend in the industry, and frankly speaking, one of the best musical, video game composers that personally I know of. Many of his songs just stand out. Like the biggest one that stands out, I would say right now, is probably Xanarkin is definitely one of his most iconic for me personally. I just love the soft piano in it. Have you guys even heard that song? At this point, I don't even know if I'm learning if my audience is younger or older, but for those who haven't experienced Xanarkin, it's a great song. But yeah, he's taking an extended leave of absence due to fatigue, which to me, it kind of means that, look, maybe we're reaching kind of the end of this guy's, you know, personal work journey. And can we really expect any more of him? He's probably composed like how many games? Like probably 10, 12, maybe 24 different games or something of the sort. I'd say maybe closer to like 15, but he's been around for a while and he's done a lot of work. And it's just so sad. But yeah, I played a little bit of the song because I'm sure most of you guys have heard of it because it's a classic one. But yeah, this is just my quick little point I wanted to bring up. It's sad. I hope the guy's doing better. And, oh, yep, someone in chat pointed out a good point that I actually forgot to mention, which is that apparently people in Japan have to take breaks for fatigue, especially in the game industry, because they push them so damn hard. But yeah, that's my last current gaming news topic. There is something else that I wanted to talk about today that's not my counterpoint, which, if you guys remember, is the segment where I talk about kind of, I play devil's advocate to a prominent kind of gaming issue or question. And this week, I didn't actually have one in particular, but what I did want to talk about was actually something that I noticed it gets mentioned a lot, and it's something that I haven't necessarily addressed before. And it's kind of that the first two things that went as MMORPGs like WoW kind of changed the industry, and many other games changed the industry. But I would say the two things that really changed from the industry are probably first and foremost community interaction, and I'm sure most people would agree with that. And then I would actually follow it up with something that I found a little bit controversial, which is why I'm mentioning it in this segment. Maybe I shouldn't have named it Counterpoint. Maybe I could have just said it's my hot take. But whatever I end up naming it, that doesn't affect the people who are listening to this. So I'm just going to change the title. But anyway, the point that I wanted to make was that the second thing to go from MMOs was actually open world PvP. And it actually goes hand in hand if you think about it to some extent, because other things left as well. If you look at crafting, and I mean deep, like crafting as an economy, like an actual like suitable economy, those are probably two things that go hand in hand more than people realize. PvP and economy are inexplicably linked. They have to be, because you need to spend money, and there needs to be a burden to spend money or resources in order to player versus player, or to have big territory engagements or wars or whatever else. There has to be an upkeep. It has to be difficult to do that financially. Otherwise, obviously, the big clans just stomp out the little clans. But what I found interesting about this link, although I'm going to say it's probably maybe causal, or maybe isn't causal, maybe it's just more of a correlation, but it's that as MMOs sort of started to lose their community interaction. What I mean by that is that no longer does the community have to interact with each other. That was kind of the way that the old games used to fix community interaction. They kind of didn't give you a choice. You kind of needed to interact with people. You saw this in EverQuest, you saw this in Ultima Online, you saw this in Asheron's Call. You saw this in Dark Ages of Camelot. You saw this in, I mean, even the more newer games. It just, you kind of needed a group. Well, as content kind of inevitably became more small group, or even solo content to some extent, you started to see some of that stuff fail. But I actually think this is a bit of like what some would call like a red herring to some extent. People think that the first thing that killed community interaction was just simply that you no longer needed to group. I see this said by Pantheon fans a lot, for example, because Pantheon's coming out and it's kind of like the spiritual successor to some extent to Vanguard / EverQuest, and it's done by Brad McQuaid, etc., etc., if you guys haven't heard of that game. But I usually see them say, oh, it's all about like returning back to cooperative like dungeon crawlers. It's all about getting the group stuff back together. But what people often forget is that it's just the game on a basis level itself has been simplified. And the maps also haven't grown. Isn't that strange to think about? As we've progressed, at this point, we're talking over 20 years MMOs have been around. for a little over 20 years. But in terms of like the I would say the vast majority of players, like the general public, the MMOs have been around for probably around 14 years, maybe 15 years would be more appropriate to say. But what I find is like MMOs have been around for 14, 15 years, and yet we still have these issues of when it comes to like the design within these games. Like, sorry, I do this thing sometimes where I'm thinking ahead to like, wait, what was the point that I was going to make before I made my point? And then it ends up making me forget. But anyway, I was talking about community interaction. Specifically, what part was I pivoting to? Welcome to the I Forget What I'm Saying podcast, starring Nerd Slayer, your host. But anyway, so what I wanted to mention was that people often look at size of group and forcing group interaction. But what I find is that as games have progressed over the years, 14 years was the point that I was making, 15 years now, the size of MMOs hasn't increased. The size of the map, I should specify, these haven't really increased. If you look at early games, they're actually quite large. Like if you look at, for example, even RPG-wise, you can look at Daggerfall. Daggerfall is much larger than Morrowind, or much larger than Oblivion, and sure, many of it's like, you know, generated to some extent. It has like that roguelite aspect. It's a procedurally generated map. So yeah, that affects it to some extent. But my point being is like, even in MMOs, like you look at original WoW or original EverQuest, original Star Wars Galaxies, and they were kind of crafted to be on the larger side. But even today, we don't really have games that are even larger than them. And yes, in the case of WoW, they've added a lot of instance content and land and sort of stuff like that. But I'm talking about just straight land mass. And what I mean is that because land mass hasn't increased, and yet the players that are playing the game have increased, the way I see it is like, you're not going to get the same type of community interaction that you used to get. Because back then it was kind of like, yes, to some extent, crafting, you needed a crafter to exist. So that creates a certain level of reliance on the community. Same thing with the games are more difficult and they require more group content. So yes, you have to band together in those certain ways. But I mean, even just geographically speaking, these days, maps are so damn small that it just feels like even if you think you're cramped together, which would make you kind of want to work together with other people, it ends up feeling like you're kind of all part of the same continent, like the same area, and you never really feel any of that danger or that sense of like differentiation between other players or other people. And I know to some people they're trying to understand like, wait, you mean like in an actual country, like someone can go to a country and not notice that there's a difference? Well, to some extent, right? We could say that some countries that are surrounding each other are rather similar, right? You'd have to go like a ways in order to actually encounter like a new culture or a new type of person. Well, in MMORPGs, this was like very common, right? Because we have so many different types of people, different countries. You might have the father who's 40 years old and who can only play this certain amount of time, or you have the kid who can play 12 hours or whatever else. But point being is that there's a more systemic issue as to why communities have been failing in MMOs, and large reasons are that maps haven't increased. There's no sense of weirdly enough, there's not a whole lot of tribalism in MMOs, which is kind of strange because you actually want there to be tribalism to some extent. You want there to be like certain factions and certain races and certain it's hilarious to think about. I never thought about that, but tribalism, you actually want tribalism in an MMORPG. It creates a war, it creates strife, it creates conflict, and that's what's good for an MMO. But as the game gets easier, as conflict kind of lowers, everyone kind of lives in the same area. We don't have races living in their own towns anymore. Name an MMO where you have a certain faction or a race really living in their actual own town. And before someone specifies one of the two factions, I'm not counting a two-faction game, okay? Because at that point, everybody lives in Stormwind and everybody lives in Orgrimmar or whatever. But nobody actually lives in the Blood Elf City, or no one actually lives in the Night Elf City, or the Tauron City, or whatever else. But you guys notice that in a lot of these games, people don't live in their own areas. The maps, despite getting bigger and bigger content, have shrunk. Everyone now lives together. Everyone is now kind of the same color and I don't mean racially, but I just mean like in a monochromatic scheme, right? Everyone starts to become this kind of silver. You're all the hero. You're all the greatest person in the game. You're all this mega god, larger than life character. When old school MMOs, the reason why they had community is because you had varying levels. You had kind of not just economical levels, but you also had levels between how much people played and the way that they played their character. So when you look at a game like Star Wars Galaxies, the reason why people always bring up pre-CU as kind of like the golden age in regards to community is largely because the game unfortunately didn't have a whole lot of content otherwise. So players kind of had to create their own content, which is one thing that actually we can even use as my counterpoint today. It's that sandboxes in most cases, and we talked about this a little bit previously, but sandboxes in most cases, which people don't want to acknowledge, especially classic fans, were just kind of there because we lacked content, or we lacked the proper tech. Players, us, the community, we created these games. Like we are the ones that made Star Wars Galaxies remembered for its community. It wasn't the developers, right? It was us. And I think that that's an important thing to point out, that it was really about the community, but it was about the community to some extent because we didn't have another choice. Like we weren't going to get another raid, right? There wasn't a raid coming. Like developer content back then was was far and few in between. Like it wasn't happening all the time as much as it is now, or it's kind of been cyclical to some extent. Now people are kind of going back to the whole emergent gameplay sandbox type of thing. Anyway, but I see people mention this a lot with pre-CU. They're like, oh, pre-CU, like it was so great because community interaction. Well, it's like, yeah, but you have to remember to some extent that developers back then were forcing people to interact with each other. I don't know necessarily if forcing players to interact with each other is the best way to do it. I actually would probably argue that the reason why we don't see a whole lot of community interaction in new MMOs as we used to is less about forcing people to interact with each other and simply is more about priorities, aka like do you just want your players to get on and do their dailies really quickly? Guild Wars 2, for example, a casual amount of play. Or maybe there just isn't the game for that level of player, for somebody who's looking for that community feel. And I mean, at the same time, that's true, because if we keep creating games in the same framework that we currently have, which is like, okay, here's our like vessel, here's our game, let's just keep putting more and more content into it and hope that we're going to keep getting more and more return from it, right? That's kind of like the theme park approach. It's like, here's our very like closed system, and it's very doctored in the sense like, we've put as much little bits of enjoyment as we possibly can into this little, 64 kilometer squared or whatever MMO map, which is probably bigger than most MMO maps. But anyway, and then we'll just keep putting in more content. Well, what inevitably happens for games like WildStar, for games like, what are other good games that failed in this kind of concept? I would say APB to some extent, SWOTOR, lesser extent SWOTOR. They stuck by SWOTOR even through its through its failures. But I was going to say that these other games like WildStar, where there's so much riding on their developer like made content being good, that if it's not good, the game itself basically dies. And I know I'm rambling to some extent, but my point is that under the current framework of MMOs, we can't create the kind of sandbox experience, the kind of community interaction experience that we want to, because we have to get back to the basics to some extent, but we also have to evolve. And so my main point was that I see people often talk about the golden age, the old games. Oh, they were so great at being sandboxes. Yeah, but that was just kind of just a product of like circumstance per se. That you can't really rely on circumstance as much. We have to rely on the developers going forward, have to look at what those games did and what they did well, take the good bits and get rid of the bad bits. And the bad bits that people don't want to talk about, for example, are the amount of downtime that you used to have in those games. And that's another huge, killer when it comes to open world content, open world PvE or open world PvP, is that takes the most time. It takes a lot of time to organize. It takes a lot of time to set up. And when you're not getting enough time to do that, or want enough time, because now you've been taught that you can only spend 1 to 2 hours and you can get all of this enjoyment from this theme park, versus having to kind of run around and make your own enjoyment, so to say. So it's obvious why the theme park market kind of took over as a whole, but I think it's funny that we're now seeing it kind of return to its roots. And I hope that the players and developers both take into account that, look, we're not going to get the same community feel just by like chance. We have to create it ourselves. So if you guys are complaining about community in your game, I realize it. If it's like, you know, a game like WoW where everything is sort of instance at this point, everyone lives out of the same city, it's kind of hard to have like, maybe unless you're at Goldshire or in some RP areas in WoW. But point being that when these new MMOs start to come out, these sandbox games, the ones that everybody has been banging their drum for, we need to we as a MMO community need to band together and work on making those games back to what we wish that they were, which is about community interaction. And I know that's partly on the onus of the developer to some extent. They need to create the kind of game that we want to play and that we want to represent or whatever else. But I also think we need to get back to our roots as players ourselves, because let's be honest, we've been trained these days to just react to like stimuli like immediately. Like, oh yes, hint of adrenaline, we're playing the next expansion, the next content, the next this, the next that. And then we realize, wait a minute, after that carrot has stopped being dangled in front of us, what's the progression here? What's my end goal? What's the bigger than life goals? What's the MMORPG goals? AKA creating my character, being unique. And we should even just talk about that, but man, do not talk about Goldshire. Oh god. Yeah, I'm not trying to advertise the wrong things here, sorry. Only RP servers in WoW have communities, to be honest, says somebody in chat, which is probably true to some extent, but that was a little bit of my convoluted rants, but that's kind of just partly my passion at this point, but also partly that there's systemic issues as to why the MMORPG market hasn't progressed as fast as we might think it should. And those are based around human psyche. And in this case, the human psyche in terms of how much time you're willing to put in versus how much enjoyment you get out of it. The reason why sandbox games were so like effective and were the norm back then was because basically every game, every MMORPG back then took time. It all took time investment. So no matter what, if you were an MMO player, you had to drop 3, 4, 5 hours, right, in order to get a certain level of enjoyment. Well, as things advanced and the genre became more streamlined, so to say, or easier, developers found that by relying on developer content instead, they can immediately give you that boost of energy or that boost of adrenaline or that boost of oxytocin, or is it tonsin? I think it's tocin. Oxytocin, the one that releases like the positive emotions, so to say. But yeah, so like they realized that they could just control it in that way. So what it kind of did in a weird way is it made it a little bit robotic. It's not quite. Isn't it funny that whenever things get streamlined, what ends up happening is at first things have to get streamlined, right? Because early UI is terrible in MMOs. Early gameplay engines are terrible. Early gameplay period is terrible in most cases. Tab target systems are so early and rudimentary at the time that combat systems are barely working, right? Like there's a lot of reasons why those games shook out to be the way that they are. But I think the saddest thing that you see these days is that the reason why MMOs these days don't have the same kind of wonder or soul to them is not because of one thing in particular. I guess I would say is my major point of this topic today. It's systemic. There's a lot of reasons, and I can go through a couple of them if I haven't already done that, but that's simply based on the fact that as things become easier, as things become more developer focused, developer content focused, it becomes harder for players to create their own content. They don't get as many tools, which means that they're not as invested into their own community. I mean, people who don't have the tools aren't going to be invested into the community. That's just common sense, right? But if you're doing your local fundraiser or your local, softball game or whatever else, you're probably pretty invested into your culture. Well, us MMO players haven't had that opportunity to be invested into our cultures. And yes, I'm sure there's many players who are invested into their games in particular who could probably say, hey, well, don't forget about me. I still exist. I realize that, but I just mean kind of as a whole. I think, and you guys would probably agree. Remember when MMO players used to be territorial or used to be almost like they had their one game and that was it? You guys remember that back in like 2005, 2006, 2007? Everybody kind of had like their one, maybe two MMOs that they played, but there wasn't so much cross-play. I think that's completely changed these days. You have MMO players, and you see this all the time in MMORPG subreddit or even in my Discord, where people are playing WoW at the same time as they're playing Guild Wars, they're playing Elder Scrolls, maybe even they're playing Vindictus or playing some random game on the side. Like these days, us MMO players have kind of become free agents because we don't really have, our loyalty doesn't really apply to any of the if our loyalty doesn't apply to any of the major games right now, we're kind of like screwed in terms of what type of content we have to play. And so I think, yeah, MMO players these days, we're far more like free agents at this point. Anyway, I'll get more into the ranting later. Let's move to my next segment, which is MMOs on the go. It's a quick section where I talk about what's going on in the world of MMOs, and I'm not always going to have the coolest bits of news to share with you guys, but I figure it's a guarantee that I can talk about MMO news every single time I do this podcast. So let me do my little change here and my transition. Okay, so in this week's MMOs on the go segment, or segment, that's a new word, segment. I'm losing my voice, apparently. Let me show you what's on the screen. New World Alpha invites are apparently going out. So people are already getting the ability to download and play their games. And I think it even is live right now. Obviously, if you guys aren't familiar with New Worlds, I would look it up. There's not a whole lot of information on it, but I figured I'd mention New World here because, frankly speaking, they've been very, very quiet up until the past couple of months, and now we're starting to see a lot more information come out, and alpha invites are even going out. So I kind of wanted to bring up this topic to ask you guys personally, what's your thoughts of New World or what you've seen of New World so far? Are you interested in it? What's interesting or not interesting about it? I'm curious. I kind of want to take the pulse of the community to some extent. I brought up this next little bit just to show you guys some screenshots if you haven't seen these. This is just concept art. This is not a screenshot. Where's the actual screen? This is a screenshot. What do you guys think? It's got a very colonial look to it. Very classic. It definitely feels very New Frontier, if that makes sense. Magical. It's got New Frontier vibes with like a magic kind of added in. What the hell is this? I hate these like autoplay videos on PC Gamer. I think the screenshots, they're pretty cool, right? It looks like it's got a dark atmosphere, something that's been just, very desperately missing from the MMORPG world. Rip in peace, World of Darkness, by the way. Rip in peace, CCP. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Amazon New World. I wanted to see what you guys thought about it. What do you think about it so far? Seems like the sextament. It looks like in chat, people were kind of saying that they're not thinking too much of it. They don't seem to really care too much. So you guys are haters. No, I'm just kidding. No, I get it. When there's not gameplay, it's hard to care as an MMO fan. And I think that the MMO market needs to learn about that to some extent. It's hard for us to care when we've been let down so many times. And once again, MMOs are these large time commitments. So it's kind of like if you make the mistake of getting so addicted to one and it ends up like sucking or it shuts down, you just wasted like 100,000, maybe 2,000 hours in a game, maybe even 5,000 hours in a game that just up and quit or up and died. It's a bit scary. Like the ever mortality of the MMORPG industry has kind of trained us as fans to be very, very skeptical. And I think that's good to some extent, but bad to other extents, because it almost seems like many of the MMORPG community, especially if you go to MMORPG subreddit, but people are so negative, they just want to say that everything's bad or points out that everything's bad immediately. And I know people will probably follow this up with, wait a minute, don't you make a statement with your whole Death of a Game series about how everything's failing? Well, actually, Death of a Game isn't just about failure. It's just about death. So it's different. I'm not the person who's only going to talk about the failure of things, because first off, you're not going to get a good story if you don't also talk about the success. But point being, you damn MMO fans, you guys are way too pessimistic right now. And I get it. It sucks. The market, it's a little bit stale, and we're not going to cry about it every single week. There's plenty of MMOs out there that you can play for fun. Even the smaller ones. There's classic servers, private servers, if you're looking for your nostalgia feel. Right now, we just kind of have to lay in hiding. And then eventually we'll be able to assume our role as Okay, I've gone a little bit past my timer today on my MMOs on the go segment. So let me move on to the next segment, and that's going to be... so actually, let's talk about Pitch Your Game. So it was something that I brought up as kind of like a cool way to interact with the audience in regards to kind of coming up with an idea of something to pitch. But what I found is that on my last question, if you guys remember, it was kind of like you got 250 to 300 words to talk about what the new Lord of the Rings MMO would be. Well, I got like 2 entries, okay? And those aren't good enough. So we're not going to run the segment this week. Instead, what I'm going to do is tie it into the later segment, Soapbox, where we're going to talk about, in a broad sense, the Lord of the Rings MMO and what I would like to call theory crafting. So we're going to do some theory crafting. I figure, hey, if you guys aren't going to do it, I'll do it. And we can do it as an audience. So let me go ahead and move to... Oh, I think I already said congratulations to Feline Knave, and I sent him his mug already. Congrats on his first pitch that he won. Let's move to the From the Vault section of the podcast, which is just a little bit of a nostalgia trip. And in this case, it's a nostalgia trip over one of my favorite art styles, worlds, and bits of humor. And that's Sam and Max. I wanted to show off some gameplay for you guys who've never heard of this game and why it's significant. This is, of course, Telltale's revival of the Sam and Max adventure games, which used to be like a television series on Canada TV, I think. Good old Canada. But this series basically was like, it's 2 detectives, private detectives specifically, but obviously they're these like, you know, larger than life or kind of comical characters to some extent. It's very, very humorous. I'm going to skip ahead to this little part where they talk to the rat.
To inform you the situation has changed, and I am unable to comply with your request. A list of additional demands for the return of the phone is as follows.
Now, let's discuss this calmly.
It's funny because
smarmy little skis and see if the phone's in there.
It's funny because Max is a rabbit, but he basically kind of acts like a wolf or some shit. He's always trying to kill everything. Anyway, this show or this game, man, I just love the swagger that it has. It's proof that Telltale, unfortunately, didn't get as much opportunity to flex their comedic chaps. I wish they did. They got famous on The Walking Dead, which unfortunately is not a very humorous franchise as a whole. But I think it's a bit sad that we won't get to see kind of more of their humor, the humor that they were responsible for. Because with Sam and Max, if you guys haven't played this game, which by the way, it's on Steam, I recommend it. But if you guys haven't heard of the series or have played it, it's kind of like this like comedic like interaction where these 2 private detectives are 2 different types of animals, 2 different types of personalities, and are basically just like it reminds me of The Wolf Among Us to some extent, but if you weren't playing as Bigsby, you were instead playing as one of the side characters, one of the more humorous characters. That's kind of how it feels. It feels very much like a fairy tale kind of universe to some extent, with a heavy focus on humor and just absurdity. Like, for example, they meet this other character later on in the story. Let me see if I could find it in the video. Yeah, they meet this other character, this little dude. I don't remember his name. Sorry for people who can't see. It's like this little boy who's dressed up, but he jokes about how he's like this like psychologist and he's gonna psychoanalyze Max or whatever else. And then or Sam, and then Max or Sam's like, well, it's actually Max that you need to psychoanalyze. It's just one of those weird, like dorky kind of humors that I just wanted to show a little bit of, because I'm going to be showing plenty of it whenever I talk about Telltale and my Death of a Game, which should come out in like 2 weeks, I would say. I don't want to put a hard deadline on it yet, but it's definitely one of those games that it has so much damn charm, and if you haven't played it already, I recommend playing some of it before the video so you can kind of get used to what type of games Telltale used to make and kind of maybe what they're not going to be remembered for to some extent. Because as things kind of progress, obviously, they're going to be remembered for their massive hit, The Walking Dead. Okay, let me move to my next segment, and that's my favorite segment, personally, Soapbox time. Let's go ahead and play my animation. To those who, of course, can't see, Just doing my little animations. No big deal. On screen. Okay, so the soapbox topics for this week are going to be story time. It's story time, boys. All right. So I get asked and often, like I would say often enough, what type of things that I like in general. I get that you guys as my audience, you try and really pin down where my interests lie and see where I fall and maybe try and put me in a box to some extent. I think I get that a little bit. So what you guys will notice about me is that I like things and I like things in a very particular way. The most important thing for me is if within whatever game, story, or anime, whatever type of art that I'm consuming, it is contained within itself, meaning that it follows its own rules, it's believable given its own premise, right? But the other big thing that I really admire in games or in stories is that if they're going to be predictable, they're good at being predictable. And if they're not going to be predictable, they have that certain level of mystery or foreshadowing that goes, I guess, with it. And so I'm going to tell you guys a little bit of a story about myself in regards to kind of how I've developed my taste in things, because people really want... for me, things are about being consistent, I would say, ultimately. But anyway, so imagine a young nerd slayer. I've got my little suit on, which, by the way, we're currently at 17 of 50 subs. So for everybody who doesn't know and can't read the chat, if you're just listening, currently we have 17 subs on Twitch of my 50-person goal. Once we reach the 50-person goal, I'm going to be doing the podcast from that point on in my detective outfit, which I'm actually kind of stoked for. But I wanted to make a quick little... This is easy to get. We can get to 50 with the podcast for sure. I can't imagine a world in a couple of months we don't get to 50. So you guys can see me start to wear the costume more often. But I just wanted to talk about that anyway. So the young nerd slayer, I'm like 5, 6, maybe 7 years old, and I discovered Sir Conan Arthur Doyle as a youngling, aka I was really, really young when I first read Hounds of Baskerville, or Sign of 4, or I think it's Sign of 3 actually is a book. Sign of 4 is the TV adaptation that BBC did. And then there's also, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I know there's Lord Blackwood. There's also, I can't remember all the stories, but point being, I was really big into Conan Arthur Doyle, aka, for those who don't know the author, Sherlock. I was big into Sherlock, as you can see back there. I was a big Sherlock fan. And so my first experience kind of with like a consistent world was Sherlock. And so after Sherlock, I started reading things like Harry Potter. And again, I was a really young kid. If you guys can't tell, with my big ass head, I was actually good at reading. So I did that a lot as a kid. I read a lot. And I was really big into the Harry Potter series, for example, when I was like 7 or whatever it was at the time. Had no business reading those books, but I somehow could piece together what they were talking about. Anyway, the thing is, though, is although Harry Potter was a great book and I liked it, it didn't change my life in the same way that Sherlock Holmes did. And Sherlock Holmes, it changed my life because it made me think, wait a minute, you can figure out things before they happen, right? It was kind of like this idea that also went hand in hand with video games. Because in RPGs, you can kind of figure out the plot, right? Once you start to like piece together things. And so what this kind of created was this boy detective that was like, trying to solve everything he ever played. So for me, it was always about trying to solve the plot, obsessively so. And so now I'm 25 years of age, and I'm still that kid detective, right? I could never turn it off. I always was that person. That's kind of why, you see what's up on the wall, the stuff that I like, but also the way that I kind of structure my content and the ethos behind my channel. It's very detective-like, and that's because I just grew up on Sherlock. I grew up on mysteries and trying to solve things. And so I bring this up to let you guys know that now whenever you ask me if I like things, you can kind of understand my thought process. It's that the majority of the time that I don't like action games or action movies or really anything of that kind of sort, it's that many of them are so predictable, and I just can't really stand the really predictable stuff. So I'm big against unpredictability. Like I really like unpredictability. I like when things are fresh, when they're exciting, and for sake of using a buzzword, emergent. And so this is kind of why I like MMOs. Is a massive multiplayer online game has endless replayability, theoretically speaking, right? Like, obviously, developer-made content is finite, especially in the current market. You can run out of content because it's so based on the developer creating content for you. But in a sandbox game, like, we can say that content is basically endless as long as they keep creating new tools and new cool things to test out and try. What did someone just say in chat? Sorry, I wanted to respond to what someone said. My moderator card says, you figure out the plot because detective, I figure it out because I write. Same result, different origin. Yeah. But anyway, so that's that kind of, guys. I hope that gives you a little bit of backstory into my taste as a person. Is things for me are very much on, are they consistent? Are they well represented within their world? And are they not entirely predictable? And just so you know, yes, many things are predictable and yet still good. There's many things that are predictable and still good. Like, you can make something predictable and make it good. In fact, I would argue like that most recent Avengers movie, the not the Ultron one. What's the one? The Infinity Stone one? I always forget the name of that one. But that one, I don't like superhero movies as a whole. Like, I'll give you guys an example. I don't like superhero movies as a whole because generally they're super predictable. Infinity War. Sorry. Is it Infinity War? Oh yeah, that's right. But anyway, superhero movies and TV shows are so predictable. It just drives me insane because it's just like, you know what's going to happen. He's going to be holding the object of power and he's going to be like, haha, you can't have it. And then like talk to the guy for like 5 minutes as he's holding it. And then the guy just like grabs it and he's like, no, I have it. Like, that's like 90% of the plot of superhero things. Or it's like, you can't defeat me. I'm the villain. By the time you talked and told everybody your plan, villainous villain, we figured out how to stop you. That's like 90% of other. Those two are like 90% of the plots in superhero things. And I know I'm shattering everybody's world. They're all like, but I like superheroes. I realize that most people do. Most people like superhero plot lines. And don't get me wrong, I love Spider-Man. Iron Man's pretty cool. Like, it's cool. Magneto's more of my style. The reason why I hate on heroes and villains and stuff is just that they're so canned. It's so predictable. And I get it. People love that stuff. But I've always kind of been more of a fan of characters like Magneto, for example, who kind of go against like traditional beliefs. He's not just this like vehemently like evil character who just wants to murder everybody. He actually has a vision, right? He's consistent. His vision is, well, humans have been trying to eradicate us the past couple of years. So why don't we just eradicate them if they're in our way and assume rightful identities as the mutant overlords? In a nutshell, that's kind of Magneto's argument, right? And he's justified. I mean, humans have repeatedly within the X-Men mythos tried to kill him. So, like, he's consistent in that, and it makes sense for him to think that way. Exactly, like Doom says in chat. Mutants are the future. Anyway, so that was one of my soapbox topics. The other one that I wanted to talk about was actually, let's open up the floor. This is to everybody. Remember, for people that are watching on Twitch or are listening to the vocal portion of this, if you want to join our Discord, you can go join the podcast lobby. You will be able to ask me a question. You will be able to comment on things that I'm commenting on, etc. That's the place that if you want to ask me a question, of course, you can ask it in chat. Make sure to @ me in Twitch chat so I can get that notification. But also, again, make sure to join Discord if you want to ask a question. I admire anybody who's willing to come on and ask me a question, even if you disagree with me. If you want to ask a question, if you want to disagree with me, that sort of thing. Discord is the place to do that, so wait in the lobby, and then we'll get to the segment after the call-in segment where we can talk about all of that juicy stuff. Anyway, what I wanted to talk about now, which any of you are willing to join in and talk to me about this as well, it's that, what are they going to do with the new Lord of the Rings MMO? And I don't mean realistically, I don't mean business-wise, I don't, like, take away all of your logical mind, so to say, the detective mind. Let's put that to bed. Right now, let's be an artist, okay? Let's just dream. Let's just get imaginative. What could you possibly imagine could be the next Lord of the Rings MMO? This means that I'm giving you guys complete freedom to create your own sort of like idea. Obviously, it has to adhere to the Tolkien universe, but let's just talk about it. And I think one of the biggest things that I wanted to talk about myself was exploration. Isn't it insane that exploration used to be one of the biggest aspects of video games and it's sort of just kind of died out to some extent? Now, I don't want to say it's completely dead. Console games do a good job of exploration. I look at like Horizon Zero Dawn. I look at some of the Dark Souls games. They do a good job of that. Yes, we are talking about the new Lord of the Rings MMO, which, by the way, there's no details leaked or anything. I'm just literally just having a discussion. I want to open up the floor so we can talk about big ideas, crazy ideas, that sort of thing. Let me join Discord. I haven't joined it yet. Okay, there we go. Just in case someone wants to come join me. But yeah, let's talk about it. Exploration, man. Exploration has not been done in an MMORPG, right? And who knows how long. And I think that exploration, as Card just mentioned, part of it is that as gamers started to get smarter, started to learn how to data mine things, started to learn how to like test things on test servers before they went live and streamline things themselves. As us as humans increase our level of ingenuity, we've kind of streamlined things inherently. Like in this case, we've figured out where all the best POIs are, like the points of interest. We've figured out where to get the best gear, how to level up the fastest, right? We've streamlined basically every aspect of an MMO, but at the end of the day, exploration kind of just fell to the wayside because of that. And I don't like this kind of rhetoric that I see players mention, which is that, well, this rhetoric exists because of this, that, and this. And then my argument is like, okay, that might be true. That might be why that rhetoric got started. But what about why it's still that way, right? Just because something is a certain way doesn't mean that it can no longer be another kind of way. And what I mean in particular is that, let's say exploration used to work in an MMORPG, right? Why doesn't it work anymore? Well, there's tons of things. There's tons of reasons, right? Someone in chat just mentioned add-ons. There's add-ons. There's now we can look at maps, right? Whenever you load into an MMO, your map is immediately like displayed. You can see everything, right? There's no sense of wonder anymore. You don't have to go out and discover things on your own. You don't have to like find map entries for yourself, which is, again, just bewildering that a single MMO hasn't done any of this. It's 2018. We still haven't had an MMO where you load in and your map is basically blank. We haven't had that. Like a AAA, like a big MMO experience that's like, basically our big tenet is that you got to figure out the game. You got to just explore everything. I think that's missing. I think exploration is probably the most abandoned tenet. I think it is. It's sad that exploration has kind of died out, but let's talk about how we can introduce it back into the game. I really think that exploration can still be a facet of a game, and just because it hasn't worked in the past, like it didn't, I should say it worked, but then kind of didn't work because it kind of got figured out. First off, the easiest way people will explain exploration will probably be you give XP whenever you discover new things, right? That's what some people say, right? Or they say something along the lines of, well, you can benefit people by allowing them that whenever they discover things, they can see new quests or new items or new emergent events or dynamic events. Well, the problem with all of that, as discovered by SWG fans and Alakazam, that website, they basically figured out the coordinates to everything. And so everything was streamlined. Like everyone figured out where to go to do this. Everyone figured out how to get this kind of quest line. And that's just the state of MMOs. We're not going to get rid of that. This is the age of information. We can never get rid of those people. That's okay. That's okay. We can't fight against those people. That will always exist. But that doesn't mean that you always have to use it. And that's the thing, is that you as a player, the reason why you get the sense of wonder in a new MMORPG so much is that it's because it's unknown to you, right? You just don't know anything yet. And I don't blame human intuition or human like desire to want to figure things out. I think that's quite natural. I think in the case of exploration, developers can do a better job of doing that. And randomizing the wildland zones regularly could reduce. Yeah, that's a good point. Someone in chat, sorry, just pointed out that what if you randomize the wildland zones, which could reduce the whole wiki/ZAM thing. I agree. And I'm with Spectrum in chat, who also says that developers are just making it too easy. Look, like, this is the MMO market right now. The most frustrating thing to me is that many of the things that we've kind of squandered away, like good things that we used to have that we don't necessarily have anymore, aren't that good anymore, or kind of just fallen by the wayside, like exploration or open world PvP. These are two things that I'm very passionate about. Community interaction is the other one. I would say those are the three ones. Community interaction, open world PvP, and what was the one that I just said? Developers making things too easy. The thing is that the reason why exploration, I was talking about exploration in particular, but the reason why exploration kind of dies out now is basically just, it gets streamlined, so we should never put effort to it. It's like, no, that's not true. Look, we can't allow for add-ons, unfortunately. Like, ultimately speaking, you guys realize that, right? Like, add-ons have to be severely limited if we're going to have them in MMOs, because they essentially take away most of the effort in certain regards. Like, when you look at, like, auctioneer add-ons that can basically figure out how to place things on a auction house, down to the science, right? Or you have these quest add-ons like WoW has, where it literally is telling you where to go, right? It's telling you exactly where to go. I know people hate whenever developers start to be really picky and choosy with their APIs and don't allow for add-ons, but I mean, this is kind of a case where you kind of don't want to. You don't want people to figure out things to that level of ease. Again, yes, people are going to streamline things. Yes, people are going to figure out things. But if we just design the next generation of MMORPGs with the idea that, well, I guess the super tryhard players are going to figure this out, or I guess like these certain players are going to kind of make this like boring or whatever else, we can't design a game that way. Because what about the regular person, or what about the person like you or me who wants that experience? We're just not going to get it just simply because the developers were too lazy, right? Or the developers couldn't think of a way to do it. That's really what it comes down to, is that as a market, like in terms of ideas, we're quite new. Isn't that weird to say after 15 to 20 years of these big MMOs existing? As a market, we're very new. We're incredibly new. And sometimes it seems like we... because of the stature of our games, because our games have budgets of $50 to $100 million, $200 million, we can't make mistakes, right? We can't be bold unless we're willing to make this big risk. And that's sort of why, obviously, the AAA MMORPG market, besides the current ones, obviously, have died out. If you're not ZeniMax and you can't pull off Elder Scrolls World of Warcraft Online, or you're not Final Fantasy and you can't pull off Final Fantasy World of Warcraft Online, or you're not World of Warcraft and you can't pull off World of Warcraft, right? Like, if you're not those big companies, if you're not Square Enix or you're not ZeniMax, like, you can't compete. You can't make the same monochromatic game. So I think that's kind of why we're seeing the niche market to some extent start to try different things, because they have a risk. Sorry, someone said in chat, it's not a risk, it's simply a mistake. Business sense is to only cater to the casual, and money always wins. That's just not true, though. Like, again, people can say certain platitudes, while generally true, can't be objectively true always, all the time, because that's just not how innovation works. You can always innovate, which changes the parameters, right? When you're programming, it changes the parameters of the discussion or of the argument. Once the parameters are changed, now you're going to have a different kind of argument. Now, if the argument is that MMOs are expensive, so you need to maximize profit, that's true, right? That's a true statement. But that doesn't mean that you can't innovate. That doesn't mean that you can't go after a niche audience, right? MMOs are starting to realize that this day and age, which is kind of strange because it's almost like the opposite of what MMOs were trying to do back then. But MMOs these days realize, like, hey, if we can just get 100K players, 20K players, 50K players, maybe we're going to do just fine, right? People are starting to think that. Maybe it's true. Maybe you don't need 100 million players. Maybe you don't need 10 million players, 1 million players, 500,000 players. You don't. It's been proven. Many games have made a business, especially MMORPGs, have made a business off of a smaller core audience. So I think as that starts to get proven to people, you start to see that, look, we can do this, we can be unique, and we can be different. But we have to get away from the idea that because we haven't figured it out yet, that means we can't do it, right? That's what prohibits innovation. And to get back to my point of exploration, I think that a new Tolkien MMORPG, a new Lord of the Rings MMORPG, would be the perfect MMO to get back to the core of exploration. Now, let's talk about a little bit, how could you get back to having exploration as a big tenet of your MMO, so to say? I would say that the maps have to be bigger. Let's just be honest, right? Wouldn't you guys all agree that if the maps were bigger, that would make exploration first off greater because there's more exploration, but it would also take exploration a longer amount of time? I'm going to say something else that will also shock people's worlds. Guess what else would increase amount of exploration? Well, differentiation between classes, between races, between factions, right? I mean, as the map grows, theoretically, and again, I'm not talking about having a map that's just inexplicably larger for whatever reason. I'm talking about a map that's like an actual open world map, like a Darkfall Online map, right? It has 4 islands with one big continent in the middle. It's a massive map. If you've ever played Darkfall Online, their map is huge. A AAA MMO doesn't need a bigger map than that for a single server. Hell no. So please don't think that I'm trying to say just create insanely large map. I'm just saying it needs to be within what framework we've already accomplished. In a game like Darkfall, we can already have this big kind of map, or even Rust on the larger servers in Rust. Even they're big enough for an MMO. Point being is a large enough map with enough factions that are actually different from each other. And once again, Tolkien is the perfect universe to do this, because Tolkien, the elves have a reason why they don't like the orcs. And the orcs have a reason why they don't like the dwarfs. And the elves have a reason that they don't like the dwarfs. And the dwarfs have a reason that they don't like the elves, right? And the humans and this and that. It all comes into play. This is like, I plead with this developer who's creating this new Lord of the Rings MMO. Please make varied starter zones. Please make varied starter zones. That's another thing that we've lost as MMOs have come back, right? Into like the limelight to some extent. It's like they're coming out with these game experiences which are the same leveling experience. They all have the same exact leveling zone. Like Bless Online, these other games, like one faction has one leveling zone, another faction has one leveling zone. It's like, no, even Warhammer Online had varied leveling experiences that were fun, that made the game fun to replay. That's what I think we need to get back to as well. Is like the new Lord of the Rings MMO is the perfect MMO to capitalize on exploration, to capitalize on actual like differentiation, actual diversity of play and class and race and faction. Because the elf, like if you, okay, let's say you load up the new Lord of the Rings MMO. In my ideal MMO, like let's say I load into the game and I'm a dwarf. I'm running, or I'm on my mount or whatever, and I travel to what's now considered the orc territory. Well, upon going to the orc territory, I'm immediately attacked. And these are both by NPCs and players. And I'm killed, and I'm like, damn. It sends me back, and I'm like, what did I learn? Well, first off, don't just assume that going to a new area in which you don't know anybody, including an orc area, is going to be safe. It's not going to be safe. And that's the truth, is to get back to exploration, we need to get rid of this safeness that's in MMOs. It's crazy how every game is so damn safe. Like playing Battle for Azeroth is the best example of this for me, where it's like you're doing these quests that almost feel like they're designed so you don't fail them. Like that's the weird thing, is like you're leveling up and you're like, wait a minute, why does this quest seem so easy? And well, it's easy because it's designed that they don't want you to die or lose to the quest. When you're leveling up in WoW, they don't want you to die to mobs. They don't want you to die to like this little mini boss or whatever that you press like one button over and over again and he just gets killed, like AKA the T-Rex in BFA. That's the kind of experience they want. They want a very kind of plastic experience, which again, I understand why. It's scalable. It applies to a larger audience. It's sexier to an investor or a publisher, right? Because they're thinking about how many people is this game going to reach. But my argument is that a lore or an IP the scale of Tolkien can get away with being different and unique and dangerous, right? It can get away with that because you can still have safe zones, you can still have easy level zones, you can still have things like that, right? You can still have tailor-made content for developers and new player experiences and all of this sort of stuff. You can have all of this. I'm not a purist in the sense that I believe we should go back to old school MMOs and everyone should be killed immediately and have like 1,000% durability loss. Like, I'm not one of those people that think that. What I do know, just as a human being and somebody who's studied these games for such a long time, is that without the sense of danger, exploration isn't as fun. And again, feel free to disagree with me. Anybody is allowed to come into chat and speak with me about it. But exploration isn't fun if you don't have danger. I mean, have you guys ever played a game where you're exploring like a new zone that you haven't been to? You're out at night. You're playing Morrowind. You're playing one of the new RPGs. You're playing Witcher. And you kind of get a little bit scared. You're like, man, can I, like, especially if it's not level scaled, you're like, can I take this boss? Like, am I going to be okay? Like, should I risk aggroing this guy? You start to get a little bit of fear, right? But it's a healthy level of fear, right? It's a fear that keeps you alive. It's the fear of like, well, I don't want to aggro this mob because like, man, he might kill me, you know? Well, in this current day and age, again, I'm the old MMO fan, and games need to go back to how they were. I know I sound like that sometimes, but truthfully speaking, MMOs, let's just be honest, besides like mythic level content, like the super difficult instance content in arenas that still exist and are still prevalent, MMOs as a whole have become easier. And I think that this is actually negative. Again, this is not an elitist argument. This is not an argument of like, oh, well, you're just like saying us casual players or us players who aren't so great are just going to get stomped on. No, look, there should be plenty of experiences for those players too. There should be farming. There should be player housing. There should be an economy. There should be tons of different types of trade resources and things that can be gathered for the type of player who doesn't want to grind all the time, for the type of player who doesn't want to fight all the time. That should totally exist, right? And if we create an MMO of a large scale, this can exist, right? Because if the elves have this giant territory, the newbie players or the players who don't want to get PK'd, so to say, would hide at the capital city, right? That just makes sense in the terms of like, in terms of like the lore, the IP, right? Within the Tolkien universe, if you don't want to get PK'd by an orc, you would hide in the elven like major town, right? Or you would try and stay near the capital cities as much as you can. But when exploration starts to get interesting is, what if your clan's like, well, we want to stake some territory, but it's kind of outside of the boundaries of the elven territory. Well, now you're taking a risk, right? Now there's an added element of exploration. There's an added element of fear. What if you lose the resources that you brought? You brought like, I don't know, 1,000 wood to build your house or whatever it is. That's the type of like thing that I would love to see in a big IP like Tolkien. Is the ability to sorry, I'm checking. What's up? Oh, you got someone that wants to move in? Sorry, I think somebody wanted to come in and talk about it. All right, we can talk about it. Kynerus, I think. Yeah, you can go ahead and move him in. Change my mind, as they say, right? Change my mind. Tell me that exploration doesn't need to make a comeback. Or tell me that... Hey, what's up?
Hey, nerd. It's Spectrum.
Hey, Spectrum.
Now, being a developer, I can talk to some of this. Exploration is tough. And one of the reasons it's so tough is the I've got an echo really bad. Oh gosh, hang on, I gotta turn something off.
And mute the stream.
Says he doesn't have the permission to speak in this channel.
No, I've got it coming from both sides. I figured it out. Okay, I know what it is now. It was coming through Twitch and it was echoing.
Okay.
Hey there.
So, all right. So the idea as a developer is you can make things to be explored, but your third party are going to kill it right away. And you touched on that. But what ideas do you have about doing that as a developer? How do we approach that?
I mean, I think it is difficult. Like, there's a reason why anything that you look at in the market, especially like in the MMO market, I feel like when things aren't prevalent or they haven't made a comeback, so to say, I feel like there's a good reason for that. And I really do think that exploration is difficult to do, because if we're going to make a game that isn't that like, okay, so let's say we're going to make a game like WoW, like a game that's kind of a little bit more self-contained at this point. At that point, it's basically impossible to introduce exploration, in my opinion, like any type of like real exploration that gets the blood flowing or anything, because everything you kind of know like what's at the other end of the spectrum, or when you load into a new zone, you're not going to expect a whole lot of different stuff. Like I feel like within the confines of a theme park MMO, it's very difficult to have exploration actually mean anything or matter at all. Those worlds are typically smaller. They're also typically not as like open-ended in regards to how players like will operate, I guess, around the map. But a sandbox game, you obviously have far more chances to, I guess, explore or have exploration be a big tenet of your game. But again, I think the reason why it hasn't been done is that when's the last time a new sandbox game came out in the past 10 years that had a bigger map than previous sandbox games? I can't think of one. I honestly can't think of one.
No, you're right. They're all small. I mean, I was part of beta with EverQuest. I think you were too. But when we were exploring, we didn't know anything, and stuff would kill you. I mean, you got out of your areas and you were dead, and then you had to go find your corpse again. So,
if I'm allowed to chip in,
yeah, sure.
I feel you mentioned that MMOs need to be more innovative. They need to go off the beaten path, so to say, to try new things. And in order to bring exploration like back into like the MMO limelight, I think we need to look outside like what's established in MMOs today, like a leveling system and things like that. I feel if you want to make exploration truly like the main focus of a game that people will want to engage in, you basically have to rethink progression as well. Because in a game like World of Warcraft or a game like Fallout New Vegas is a good example as well, where if you take the wrong turn to the left or whatever, you find like these deadly scorpions that are like 10 levels above you, and they'll just kill you instantly. And that kind of discourages exploration, I think. I think it's important that no matter where you go, you should always have like a reasonable chance of being able to survive on your own at any given time, because that will allow people to keep going where they would otherwise stop. I think that's a good idea.
Well, it's funny you brought up New Vegas, because if you do explore, you can find some really good gear out there in the wasteland. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see what you're saying to some extent. I think my dangers of such a thing is if people are allowed to be too self-sufficient, they just inherently won't interact with other people. That's just the unfortunate truth. I'm not trying to say that necessarily maybe there isn't other things you could add to counterbalance that. Maybe there is to some extent, but that's probably my biggest concern of the idea of making it to. And don't get me wrong, Darkfall is very much that kind of game. Darkfall, you are very self-sufficient in regards to I can escape if a medium group attacks me or something. I can get away. I have a mount. I have ways to kind of slow my opposition down or whatever else. But back to what you were saying, just so I can specify, I don't think that MMOs have to innovate just simply because it's better for them, in terms of a market decision. Or, sorry, I should say economically. It isn't. That's the kind of scary thing is for an MMO to take a big risk, it could potentially be very bad for them, right? Or very wrong for them. So I understand the ramifications of trying to do different things. So whenever I say that the market needs to innovate, I'm kind of just speaking about it in a general sense that I do think that that's the case. I mean, otherwise we're just never going to move forward, right? I don't know about you guys, but when I think about MMOs, I think about virtual reality, right? I mean, that's really what I think all of us thought about when we first played an MMO is
like a holodeck, things like that.
Right. Yeah. All of us are thinking about, possible ideas of hologram technology or some type of headset you put on and some type of moving ball where you can everyone has this crazy idea in their head of their Total Recall moment where you can load into this world. Well, in order to get to that point or get anywhere close to that point, which obviously we're nowhere close to that point. I mean, we can't even have VR games that are good on consoles. So good luck trying to get an MMO that can work. But anyway.
Well, To be fair, I think that's more of a technology issue, not necessarily
Well,
an
no,
innovation issue.
that's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say it's simply because we don't have the tech yet. But that's the funny thing about MMOs, isn't it? That we first came out with these, I guess, brand of MMOs that were very, very ambitious and very different and new because they were the first ones. And then after a while, the innovation in the technology itself kind of got stifled. I mean, when's the last time that an MMO developer really pioneered tech? Like tech? I mean, I guess Star Citizen's trying to do that, but I think that's more of like their kind of gimmick thing, more than maybe.
I don't know. I don't think it's really fair to count Star Citizen. I mean, it's that game is, in my opinion, like a borderline scam at this point. I am deeply skeptical about Star Citizen. We will probably have that tech IRL before that game comes out, but we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
Well,
just to continue on Star Citizen for just a moment, I just want to say that game will be one of the biggest news events in gaming ever, regardless of what happens, because either they will deliver on everything they promise and it's going to be like the best game ever and huge news, or it doesn't deliver and a ton of people will feel scammed and it's going to be the biggest news in gaming ever. So
my biggest thing with Star Citizen, I think they need to stop all these future goals that they're doing, that they're trying to implement before the game is out, and basically get their core game out there ASAP, and then do patches later on, bringing in the future stuff.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about Star Citizen now because I'm still talking about Lord of the Rings. But anyway, back to Lord of the Rings.
Yes, you're right.
So how do you make an exploration system? I mean, it's a fascinating idea, and the way to do that is when things are new and there's not a lot of information out. Do you think that there's a way that you could do it with instances to where it's not the same?
I mean, I think like if we have a larger size map, more dangers on the map, and then also I guess you would say an actual like economy to some extent, or at least within the confines of the game. Those are multiple different ways I think that you can encourage or have exploration be useful, because ultimately speaking, yes, at some point a map is going to be fully explored. That just happens, right? That happens in single player games, happens in multiplayer games. It doesn't happens in the universe, like within our world, right? We've basically discovered where the majority of life is. We have continents, we have civilizations, etc., etc. So like that's just normal. But I think when I think more of exploration in an MMO, I think more of like the idea of, well, if we're going to go take territory, that's going to require us to take a risk, to bring resources, to bring our group, and possibly try and stake out maybe within another zone that's not protected by, like in the case of Tolkien, it's not protected by the Elven Kingdom or whatever else. That I feel like is more so exploration. So whenever I say, how do you make it exciting? Yeah, ultimately speaking, people are going to do gimmicky things always, and they always will, but they're just going to give you XP. They're going to give you more resources, but it has to be about that. It has to be about economics, like to some extent. I mean, it's kind of like when you look at EVE Online, like the biggest thing in EVE Online is the economy. Without the economy, none of the game works. And I think exploration is kind of the same way. It's like it has to be based around the economy as well. So when you load into a game, you might not have a tool called the prospector's tool that helps you like figure out parts of the map or whatever else. Maybe that doesn't exist. Maybe that's too complicated of an idea to do, but it's not against the realm of possibility to do like a surveyor, right? To where maybe when you load into your game, you're only given the recollection of what a map is based on what somebody has drawn. So like that's another idea. Like you can make it to where the community has to create their own map.
Fog of War.
Yeah, like Fog of War with actual like cartography. Like maybe someone has to actually draw a map within the game.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Again, people are going to counter this with
exploration. And the point of exploration to me, if you look at it from a Lord of the Rings standpoint, I want to come across a stream, and in that stream it goes into a cave. I go into that cave and I hear someone echoing, "My precious, my precious." Okay, I mean, that's what it comes to. Okay, so how, as a developer, how could we create something that doesn't just get mapped out and somebody says, "Hey, you go to this cave over here by the big tree and go up this stream," and and now it's ruined for everyone.
Here's the depressing thing, dude. I don't think you ultimately can. I don't think you can stop people.
I was about to suggest the very same thing. People, the vast majority of people are going to take the path of least resistance to get to goal X, Y, or Z. So if a few hardcore people will, do things by themselves, but I think the vast majority of people just want to jump into a game for like an hour or two because they have work in the morning or whatever, get some loot and jump out. And they will, if they can't figure it out through the game, then they'll just look up a guide or something.
Yeah. But then making a big map becomes useless. You might as well have a map that's 10 by 10. Okay, go from here to there, and you understand where I'm going with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right, but if you talk about scripted events, I mean, like there's ways. Obviously, our AI as a whole isn't as advanced as maybe we would like, but I mean, AI is advancing as a whole. So I mean, it's not out of the question to see dynamic AI, for example, roaming mobs. Like that's possible.
Procedural quests.
Yeah,
procedural quests.
Things of that nature. I mean, we've already seen that with Elder Scrolls' system. But I mean, ultimately speaking, yeah, you're right. Like people are going to streamline it, but my argument is that you can't create the game to be based around the idea that people are going to do the worst with it. I don't think you really can. Like, yeah, you want to maybe not spend 3 years of your development cycle focusing on building a map that's going to be totally unique, and then within 1 year everything is figured out. Like, yeah, that's just going to happen. Yeah, I say one year would have been EverQuest or Star Wars Galaxies. This day and age, yeah, I agree. It's like 3 months. So
yeah, it's 3 months.
Ultimately,
people. If you get YouTubers out, then you're going to have all these walkthroughs that are done, and you can't go anywhere with a game without YouTubers. So you're kind of stuck.
That was the next point I'm going to bring up. I mean, people on YouTube, they're going to create. They want to get the YouTube hits, so they're going to create the quick guides, the best guides, the ultimate performance guide, things like that. What's the best build to get those YouTube clicks? So they're not just exploring and writing stuff down. They're actively competing to be the first one to map everything.
Yep.
But I love exploration. You're right. I love it. I mean, there is nothing like the days of EverQuest or Kingdom of Drakkar. Okay, I mean, you've never been here before.
I've never even heard of that second one.
You haven't heard of Kingdom of Drakkar? It has the best mechanics in an RPG, in my humble opinion. Okay.
All right, that's a pretty bold claim.
It is an old school game. My friend Brad built it, and you should check it out. Kingdom of Drakkar has some very, very good mechanics.
You mentioned old school one. What year are we talking? Like when did it came out?
Probably 88, 87. Okay. It's still online.
Yeah. Just after I was born. All right.
Okay. Yeah. See, I'm an old fart. I'm 55. So.
All right, I'm 32, so I'm still pretty old compared to almost everyone here.
I got a kid older than you, so.
Is it a mud?
No. Well, it was one of the first graphical games, and if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. It's a very good game. It's along the same lines of Island of Kesmai, which was on CompuServe. So.
I think I've tried that game once, and I just couldn't get into it because it required like perfect spelling and stuff.
No, it's all not this one. This one it's all graphical. You can click and put. I didn't mean to change the subject, guys, but it's got.
Yeah, I was kind of waiting. I was like, you guys remember where?
Sorry, dude. Yeah, but see, you also have to base things, nerd, on what your experience is from too, because we're talking about a new game, and.
It'll all be new at first, right?
I think instances. I think the only way to do it is do it with procedural based instances. That way, you can't just say you go here and do this.
But see, I think that for me has always come across as gimmicky. It always seems gimmicky whenever people talk about roguelite systems, because I'm like, it's cool in theory, but you realize like, yeah, the car is here instead of there, but how different is the map really? I mean, it's not. It's not a whole lot different. It's probably the same size, maybe a little bit, maybe a cave instead of a river in this one. Like, I understand that to some extent, but I guess my argument is not that we can ever stop them from mapping out the map. It's that if we're going to allow for them to do all of that, which I mean, we can't stop them at this point. If we're going to have these systems be streamlined, at least make it to where the game can still function, even if you have it streamlined. Like, even if you figure out, hey, you go to this cave, you can do this kind of certain quest. Well, we can always create new quests. It's not an issue. Like of that, that's kind of where the developer content comes in, right? If we're going to be spending money on it, especially if it's a free to play game, like, I mean, hopefully that maybe the content pipeline is going to go towards something of that sort. But at the same time, if you create, I mean, let's talk about really like the thing that I wanted to get into the most was the concept of like a virtual world. And it's like, that was the initial idea of EverQuest, right? That's the initial idea. Like, what do they call it? The plan? Or there's like that famous document that the EverQuest devs used to have, where they basically had this, like, these tenets that were lined out of like, here's the type of game we want to create. And it was that they ultimately wanted to create a virtual world. And that's what I think is crazy to think about. We don't have a virtual world yet. Like, name one MMORPG out right now that's a virtual world. There's basically none. Like, we don't have that yet.
No.
Can you be more specific to what you mean with a virtual world?
So virtual world is essentially like the idea that when you log off, the world is still functioning on its own. It doesn't need you as a player. Like from a development standpoint, a theme park game without you doing the content, like someone else does the content, sure, and it's like the same content, and people make fun of that all the time. But anyway, it's not going to happen. The world is like that one NPC who looks like he's like, I don't know, making armor or whatever in that one town. He's not actually making armor. It's just for show. He's just showing you an animation. He's not actually doing anything. That's not a virtual world. A virtual world would be like NPCs would actually be contributing to the game. They would actually be, say, for example, guarding or maybe going on patrols, or maybe you have to actually, like, in, I think it's at Grand Screa or Project Gorgon, where you have to like submit the crafting things to the actual NPCs and they do it for you. Like that kind of thing.
Okay.
Hey, can I say?
Sure.
So basically, I think the best thing for exploration is, unfortunately, something we can't really do right now because, like you said, the virtual world. That's like the closest thing we have to that is EverQuest. I mean, not EverQuest, but Guild Wars 2. But that's not really all that good. But we got to focus more like on a true AI, where like NPCs would move around the world and create new events and that stuff as the game happens to go on and on and on. Like maybe a bunch of ratlings that would move into an area and create a brand new tunnel system that you could explore. But that's only happened because the NPCs decided to invade certain areas. Players maybe lost the battle, and now that they have burrowed deep into the ground.
I mean, it's a good point. I probably will end my soapbox with this point. You guys can talk about it if you're still interested in it. But I think that AI, isn't it weird to think that our AI hasn't really seemed to increase that much? Like, name a game that's come out recently, an MMO that's come out in the past like 5 years, that's had this like really crazy emergent AI, or like an adaptive AI, or a dynamic AI of any sorts. I can't think of any. Like, when's the last time you've seen, Spectrum, a game have roaming AI? Like, I can't think of it. Like, it doesn't really happen all that much.
It's still not ready yet. There's a way to go. I mean, Unity is making that available right now. They have a pack, and I think it's at 0.3, if that gives you any idea where it is in development. But it's still very rudimentary at this point. So, I mean, I've looked at it with my game, and it's just not even close to doing it. Most likely, the best way to do it is you'd have game masters, just like in a D&D game, that would tell the NPCs what they need to do at that point.
Okay, and that's actually something that I think also should be explored more, is that, yes, it's difficult for developers to make content, but what's kind of crazy that you don't see a whole lot in even just WoW. Like, I feel like WoW was a perfect opportunity for them to do this, but it's kind of like how Matrix or EverQuest had the whole story development team, where basically their whole point was to roleplay as certain NPCs and progress the plot. I feel like with these AI, that'd be so much easier to do if the AI is that much better. You don't have to play them anymore. You can just tell them what to do, like you said. You can say, hey, go to this zone and do this activity without having to actually play, in this case, Sauron or whatever, or Saruman. Like, you don't have to play these characters yourself as the developer. You can have this AI that, you know, does a simple function like attack this city or whatever, but can still do something. Yeah, it's weird to think about that. Many of our problems, it seems to come down to tech, but maybe it's because we haven't been trying to like actively look for this type of tech that we need, because we haven't been innovating as much as we need to, which I feel like is probably a good argument. But or maybe we're just not there yet.
Yeah, we're just not there yet, I don't think.
I think coding's also a problem because we're using like code from like the 1980s.
Well, I feel like that MMO developers, etc., game developers, aren't really in a hurry to do all that, because I feel like where the money is coming from right now when it comes to games, I don't really think. I mean, it would make those games a little bit better, but I don't think like pursuing that is like whether the direction the money's coming from these days. I don't think it really plays towards those kinds of the kind of activities that would benefit from having those AI things.
I agree. I agree.
I also agree.
I would probably agree with that as well. I think that right now the market hasn't really asked for that yet. But one thing I will say, and this actually, I'll use this as an opportunity to transition to the hot take portion of the podcast. Which, where the hell is my transition? I can't find it for some reason, but I'll just put it on screen. All right, so we're gonna transition to the hot take portion of the podcast, where everybody's allowed to ask a question. Either come into the Discord and ask me your question, or you can @ me on Twitch chat. Whatever your question is, we'll get to it. It doesn't need to be just about MMOs, and it doesn't need to be just about gaming, but obviously those are like the biggest subjects. But anyway, going on what you were saying, let me change this image really quickly. I think that to some extent, sorry, what was the point that you just made, Kindness? I'm trying to remember.
That's the sources of revenue in games, especially online games.
Right.
Do you remember?
Yeah, I remember now, actually. Sorry, I do this all the time, so...
Oh, it's all right. There's a lot going on.
I appreciate you guys reminding me, but anyway, the thing that I wanted to mention is that I'm not convinced that developer content is the most economical way to do it. I really, like, show me an example where a game is basically almost solely reliant on developer content, and I'll show you the only example, and that's World of Warcraft. Like, I think it's the only game that can 100% live or die based on its development. You know, it's constant influx of new development, or developer content, I should say.
And I agree with you. That was one of the problems with EverQuest. They built all that land, all the snow land. I forget what it was called. It was out and there was 2 cities and blah blah blah. But there was all this land, and you would just go through it. And after they made the next set of content, that place was never used again. Frozen something. I forget what it was called. Dwarfs lived out there and stuff. But it was beautiful. Nobody ever used it.
Yeah, and the reason why I point this out is because, along the lines of what Kairos is saying about the kind of revenue streams, is that I think developers, frankly, in the past couple of years, like, and I want to say short time, like I want to say past, so maybe 6 years, really understood that having heavily tailor-made developer content that's like expansion based or content patch based just isn't as economical as it used to be. And I think this is proven with SWOTOR to some extent. This is proven with WildStar. This is proven with, I mean, WildStar basically at one point said like, hey, I remember how we used to add new zones and that was part of our content patches. Well, we can't do that anymore. And basically everyone was like, all right, and they kind of stopped playing the game, right? Because like they thought that was kind of like the big point, was like these new zones and these new raids or whatever else. But once they realized that wasn't coming, they're kind of like, all right, well, there's basically no more future for this game. But I mean,
now you're back to exploration. That takes us right back to the full circle again. We're back to having something new.
Well, I would argue that that's a slightly different case, because I do think that adding new zones as content is very risky. I think it is actually very risky because it's kind of like, yeah, you can add new content, new areas or whatever else, but like you said, those areas are just going to be abandoned unless you're going to create them again to function within a virtual world. Then it's different. I feel like it's a different context from when you're just being like, I'll add one more instance or I'll add one more zone with like one more quest line, and then it's basically the last time that you'll ever go to that zone. I think in order to like have economical content for a sandbox game, you can't create content like that can be just, you know, eaten so quickly. And I mean, WoW is even realizing that with BFA. Look at how much trouble they've been going through. People are basically telling them, hey, you didn't make enough content. And they're like, hey guys, it's coming out, you know, you shouldn't expect it yet, or whatever else they said. Hey, if you don't like it, don't play the game. It's like, well, everyone's angry because they're like, well, you know, the previous expansion, I didn't have to wait until you released content for the expansion when I paid for the expansion. But I think that if even WoW is suffering from developer-made content as being like basically not sustainable, is what I'm trying to say. If the Mac Daddy of all MMOs is suffering from that, I mean, shit, is it really sustainable for anyone else?
I think this is has to do with a larger issue with this, which is a shift in gaming in general, particularly MMOs, where if you look at what the most profitable games like on the market are right now, and I'm talking mostly mobile games, they make like crazy amounts of money. Like Fortnite on mobile, Fate Grand Order, which is like this waifu collector game, makes like $120 billion a year. I mean, if you're a game developer and you have like, and you have to commit all these giant budgets to creating this MMO, I mean, why would you do that? Why not create some kind of mobile game like Nintendo has with like Fire Emblem Heroes? Just pour like maybe $10 million into making those games and then print a ton of money. I mean, I don't think we'll. I think MMOs, like the big AAA ones, are kind of a dying breed. If we see another, like, I think maybe one or two big AAA MMOs will come out. I think that's going to be it. I think they're like a thing of the past, to be honest.
I'll disagree with that.
I disagree too. I think it's first off, it's a little bit different of a point than I was trying to make. I was trying to have the discussion of developer-made content versus player-made content. Which, if you guys watched the EverQuest video that I did, I talked about it a lot. And I think Smedley also mentioned it. Apparently, Brad McQuaid disagreed because he's not doing that with Pantheon. but the argument behind that whole video was essentially that developer-made content is not sustainable, and player-made content, aka emergent gameplay, is basically the future. Is what the argument of Smedley and his whole team was, and that's what they were trying to do with EverQuest Next. And obviously, that didn't end up working out, but I do think that the point that he made is true. Because if you're, like, in this day and age, can we even get away with just releasing expansions for MMOs? Like, seriously, like, what other MMO gets away with that besides, like, the major ones? Like, I don't think a lot of these, I guess what I would call niche MMOs are releasing expansions. Not really.
Well, no. Maybe I wasn't really clear. Let me clarify. So you mentioned that like developer-made content isn't enough to keep an MMO afloat. Basically, that's becoming more and more apparent. But maybe like 5 years ago, when before the shift we're seeing right now, even though it may be a suboptimal way of getting like keeping your game going, it was still basically the way to go. But right now, like, with this content that the developers are pushing out not being enough, there's extra incentive to not do it with the market shift. So it's gonna. I feel like they now have even more reason, besides it just not being enough, to not like develop for these types of MMOs. Is that making sense?
Yeah, no, I understand, and slightly off topic, but Doom, should we join the other chat if we want people to come in and ask questions, or should I?
Yeah, we should.
Okay. Okay, so that's just so everyone knows. You can come join the podcast lobby within the games discussion channel of my Discord if you want to ask any questions. And if you don't have an opportunity to talk, just wait patiently and talk or send Doom Black Dragon a message, and then he'll queue you up. Currently, today we did a little bit different. I kind of just had people join into the chat, and I know it made things not as organized, but in this case, we're just trying new things. But anyway, to get back to what you were saying, and maybe Spectrum has a point too, or anybody else has a point about the MMO market as a whole. But I think that I refuse to say that, first off, just off of principle, that it's going to die. But besides my whole, ride or die mentality, to look at it from an analytical standpoint, I think that what you said right now is absolutely true, that there's no incentive, really, like big incentive for a big AAA MMO to come into the market. But that's only because of the way things are right now. Like when you look at markets as a whole, especially like video games or entertainment, it's kind of like peaks and valleys, right? It goes up and goes down.
Sure.
So there's like a boom and a bust, so to say. It's kind of cyclical in certain natures, and I think currently right now the market is very much in its growing pains phase. Like we've had immense growth, and maybe what we think is like the ceiling, aka WoW. Like we don't know if that's the ceiling of what we could possibly reach yet. I mean, I refuse to believe it is, obviously, but that's sort of what we're thinking. All of these big investors and all of these big companies that came in and tried to make games, Age of Conan, SWOTOR, WildStar. I mean, there's like a bajillion other examples. Just check out my channel, Tabula Rasa, etc. Like all of these games, APB, all these games that were these big budgets or whatever else, and were supposed to be the next big thing that ended up failing. And they all failed, if you remember, around the same like time, kind of like what you were saying, like previously, like the past, like I think it was like maybe 2013 or 2009 through 2013 was like the boom period, right? MMOs were coming out like every day. Like it felt like every day, but it was more like every month or every other month. But yeah, it felt like it was just all the time. But I think that's just a natural thing. Like whenever a market gets developed, you're always going to have the big guys, the big suits or the big wads of cash. They're going to come into the space and try and occupy it immediately. In the case of like if you look at things like Starbucks, for example, like Starbucks started as this like kind of small community-based coffee place, but once it like got its immense level of success, we didn't just see the rise of Starbucks, we saw the rise of like Dunkin' Donuts and all these other companies that were basically doing like similar formats and iced coffees. And look at, now McDonald's has its own iced coffee and it's like the giant or whatever. It's kind of copying what its competition's doing. The point being is like once there's money there, once they sniff that there's money there, people come in and they're no longer interested in trying to innovate. They're just trying to turn a profit. It's a business for them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of what we saw in a lot of cases. Is that's why these investors and publishers first off are so willing to just get rid of a product, is because they're not married to the product in any way other than financial reasons, which means that as soon as it starts to not do well, they have to cut their losses and immediately quit. Go ahead.
Yeah. I feel like that's happening to the battle royale genre right now.
Yep.
It happens to almost every genre. If you look at history in gaming, something comes out, it's a successful formula, all just copy it. Sometimes they can beat it because they manage to innovate it in a certain way that is actually more interesting. And if they don't, then generally what you see is that they take a small portion of the market but relatively quickly fade into non-existence again.
Yeah, aka high risk.
If you want to go into a market that is established, you need to innovate in a certain way that makes your product similar enough yet different enough for it to stand out. As for AAA MMOs, in my personal belief, I really think they have a good chance to come back, but they need to go back to ground zero, and somebody just needs to say, okay, we need to stop looking at anything that we have had and make something that's truly new again.
Well, that's going to be on the burden of that burden, in my opinion, is going to be on the indie developers. It's going to be on the Kickstarter games. Like I think it's going to take these more kind of ragtag groups of developers to make a product that's going to blow up. Kind of the similar situation to EverQuest and Ultima Online to some extent. Kind of like the small startup company is going to make this game that's going to potentially, hopefully, innovate enough that's it's going to be exciting. And then a big investor or publisher is going to come in, basically take the similar formula and do kind of what you said. Maybe they innovate a little bit. Maybe they streamline it. Maybe they just add more money to the whole affair. But point being is I feel like that's why these Kickstarter MMOs to me are so important, is that I want them to succeed. I want them to be innovative because that's what's going to attract the big dogs. That's what's going to attract more AAA MMOs. But I mean, as it stands, yeah, I totally agree. AAA MMOs right now aren't sexy at all, and they're only sexy for pre-existing IPs. I mean, I made this point in one of my other videos, but I mean, look at the games that exist right now. Elder Scrolls Online, you have ZeniMax, and they've had the Elder Scroll games for the past like 20 years or whatever at this point. You have Square Enix. They've been making Final Fantasy games since the late 90s, right? You have, obviously, WoW's a little bit of an anomaly in the sense that it kind of was like this RTS that then became an MMO. But obviously, at this point, we would all say that it's been around forever. It's basically like the big daddy MMO. But what other
Blizzard
games
is
are there?
Also, the track record that Blizzard has as a company.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
That track record is actually one of the other points. Like a reason I see is a lot of these MMOs failed, and when you look at them, is they were seriously lacking in polish. And Blizzard, for example, and other companies that have the funds to do that, they can spend that money to polish that game. They can make sure that it feels well, that it looks good, that it runs well. And those are things that do make quite a difference for people in the long run. Because a small niche audience is not going to complain about it, but a mainstream audience will.
And I think we're also going to see a lot of innovation coming from smaller companies. And that's the guys who wrote Doom say innovation does not come from large companies, it comes from two guys working in a garage somewhere.
Agreed.
And Unity is helping small developers do that. Right now, you can buy an MMO pack, will support 5,000 players, and it's $800. And I think we're going to start seeing some of that seeds from that in the next 2 to 3 years of small MMOs that can make money. A small team can be very, very happy on 10,000 players.
I totally agree. And I think that that's a really interesting point that maybe most of us don't really look at as much. We don't look at the tech. It's not as interesting maybe especially for us players. We're not interested in the tech as much as we're interested in playing a game. But I mean, truthfully speaking, we don't have our Unreal Engine. Like MMOs don't have our Unreal Engine. We don't have our typical like RPG Unity, or we don't have these other, we don't have our TES like tool set. Like we're not creating MMOs left and right, but as things become, obviously, as you've been mentioning with Unity, more streamlined and more affordable, then the person in this garage that has this great idea might actually do something with that idea. They might actually create something. And then of course, look at like Fractured, for example. I wanted to talk a little bit about Fractured MMO. They have this idea of like doing an ARPG MMO, which first off, I think that's my hot take for this week actually, is that the ARPG market, the MMO ARPG market is going to be like the next gold mine in the next couple of years. That's my assessment. I think that Blizzard is actually working on one. I think Blizzard is going to be working on an ARPG type MMO. I really think they will. With Diablo. I think they have the perfect opportunity to do so. And like Card said, they have the money to work on it as long as they need to. So I mean, we know they're always working on something behind the scenes, and I'm speculating to some extent, but I really think that the MMO ARPG market is going to blow up. I mean, look at the success of Path of Exile, both PoE, but Path of Exile has had this immense success to the point to where it's basically, for lack of better words, cucked Blizzard at its own game, right? And Torchlight, exactly. Pin Zero in chat just mentioned Torchlight. Frontiers is basically kind of like this ARPG MMO, like light. I say light because I don't know how massive it actually is. It looks like it's kind of similar format to Path of Exile. But point being is I really think that we're going to see a lot more of those types of games. And I think the biggest reason is it's much more affordable to make that kind of game, to make a 2D action-based MOBA style game than it is to make a, fully realized 3D physic, based engine. Those are just unheard of. We've only seen like 2 of those.
I do wonder though how big the market is actually for that type of an MMO, especially an enemy for a larger scale market. Like I'm fairly certain there's going to be a niche market, but is there really going to be a AAA level market for that? Because it's quite a difference if you're looking at a 2D isometric perspective versus a fully realized 3D world. And a lot of people do like that 3D environment.
Yeah, they do. But the interesting thing is that I think Path of Exile has managed to essentially operate in this kind of niche for a while now, because when they came out and basically did Diablo 3 better than Blizzard could, I think everyone sort of realized that ARPGs, like, they're not going anywhere. They're still good enough to compete against AAA developers. Like, the market is still fresh enough that an indie company can compete against the company. And I think that in itself shows that there's going to be more growth within the market. But yeah, I will say ultimately, I mean, if you asked me, hey, if you could choose an engine, would you choose a 3D physics-based engine or a 2D like MOBA style engine? I mean, I'm gonna 99% of the time choose the 3D engine with physics, because I think that personally is the coolest engine idea, but is also the hardest. It's the hardest one to implement.
Probably the most expensive one too.
Well,
Yep.
actually, with Unity and UE4 now, they're making it cheap enough for the guys in the garage to do it, though. And if you look at Autodesk, they have a version of Maya that's light, and it's only $35 a month.
I think that's exciting to think about. I really think it is, and I can't personally wait until we start to see maybe some of the successful MMOs, or hopefully successful Kickstarter games. Maybe if they have success, they can start to also sell their engines as well. I mean, I know Crowfall is looking to do that to some extent. Camelot has talked about that to some extent as well.
Oh, I hate to be a negative Nancy, but I think you guys are right. I think we're going to get, instead of like big giant, super huge MMOs, we're going to get like smaller projects made by smaller teams, and they're going to find their own audience, and they're going to do fine. They're going to make a good existence. But to kind of just wait for like a sleeper hit, basically like an indie developer to hit gold, I think that's I think that shows that the MMO scene, the MMO market is kind of in a sorry state. There's no big, the next big thing is not on the horizon. It's basically people are just doing their thing in the little dark corner, isolated from the rest to an extent, and hope that they strike gold.
Well, I thought that Blizzard said they weren't going to do any more major AAA games after StarCraft 2.
I highly doubt the next Diablo 3 will be some kind of MMO. I don't think Blizzard will do any MMO ever again.
Yeah, I think they found that games like Hearthstone, Heroes of the Storm, and that stuff made them more money in the long run because it took less to develop, and it's all they do is sell loot boxes.
Yeah, it's like I said before, those mobile style games, with that are borderline pay to win. That's right now. That seems to be the future. I mean, like Nerdslayer said, I mean, the market changes, the scene changes. So maybe in 10 years' time, we'll look back and say, "Oh, that Kineris guy was totally wrong," and I accept that. But based on the information, based on what I'm seeing now, that seems to be the direction we're going.
I do wonder, though, because like if you're going to say, well, we're not going to make any more enormously large MMO, are they going to manage to keep Warcraft going? That's like one thing, but if
they won't, and that's why, as a business person myself, I'm on the same vein as you. I don't see a way that they're just going to give up with WoW. Like, there's just no way that Blizzard is ever going to give up that level of control over the market, even if it's not the best economical thing for them. I don't see it.
As long as it makes money, it is also it's also a very large PR tool, of course, because if you look at Blizzard, everything that they sell, like they make editions that they sell stuff that is within their other games. They try to keep people within that ecosystem of themselves. So they want to have games that target all of those markets, and ideally people that are in multiple of those markets, so they can have, if somebody wants to play a MOBA, a card game, and an MMO, well, great, you can do it all within our ecosystem, so you don't need to spend money anywhere else.
They have that ability. Isn't that insane, though? That a company like Blizzard could put Hearthstone in their MMO if they wanted to. So
there's another layer to this as well, because World of Warcraft is such a huge beast on the MMO market. I mean, it's the biggest subscription-based MMO in the world. I think even if it wasn't profitable, if it made some kind of quote-unquote acceptable loss, they would still keep it going, because even though they're not making money, they're still making things harder for their competitors. Because if they were to pull the plug on WoW, those players would go to Final Fantasy or Guild Wars, and they would strengthen their competitors.
Okay, that's a good point. So are you trying to say to some extent that maybe it's better if we take the dog out to the shed, or
it could be, yeah, it could be.
I actually think WoW lost its title of King of the MMOs. I think Final Fantasy XIV surpassed it recently.
Sub-based, definitely not.
That would depend on what you mean by surpassed it.
Yeah,
In
maybe
terms of
in player
sub
count. Yeah.
Subbase said they did do a celebration of their 10 million subs last year.
Well, like 10 million players, which means that everyone who has ever played the game, that's like 10 million people. But if you're talking about concurrent players,
No, subs, active subscriptions.
are we talking about Final Fantasy?
Yeah, Final Fantasy XIV had last year over 10 million active subscriptions.
Is that true? I don't really think that's
I
true.
think there's some miscommunication going on, because I'm fairly confident that World of Warcraft has like at least 10 times as many players as Final Fantasy XIV.
As far as I know, the last time I checked the statistics, I think Final Fantasy had maybe like 2.5 million, and ESO had like 3 or something like that. I'm pretty sure
That's
ESO
only
was
on the
ahead of
Steam.
it.
No, and people actually stay away from the Steam version of Final Fantasy because Steam version is actually not compatible with any of the non-Steam versions. You literally are locked into only using Steam version of Final Fantasy XIV. Everyone,
I just found an article that supports his argument. Put it in the chat.
Huh.
I know that because last year they had a massive sale on their in-game store, their cash shop, of like 50 to 80% off on all items because they hit 10 million subscriptions, active subscriptions.
Yeah, somebody in chat did say they're huge in Japan, which, first off, I know that's a joke, but I don't think MMOs are big at all in Japan. So I get the meme there. There's a meme there, but the Japanese populace doesn't really play multiplayer games that much. They play console games.
The Asian market has 3 mega servers over there. While the
Well,
US
Asian market is different because Koreans love MMOs, but
Yeah,
generally speaking, Japanese people
Chinese
haven't
as well.
as much.
Yeah, it's big in the Asian market. It is actually pretty big.
Yeah, it says that they're 2 million short of World War. Hey, I wouldn't mind second place any day.
I think at that point, yeah, they're definitely calling it a success, especially when you take into consideration that Realm Reborn was created out of the ashes. Like it was like basically going to be a failed MMO. It was going to die. And they said, nah. And only Square Enix, I swear, would do such a thing. Like would just basically stake the whole rest of their like reputation on remaking an MMO. I feel like that's just the Japanese culture. You just can't give up, right? Like I did a whole video on it. It's pretty admirable, but to see, especially in 2018, man, I didn't realize they were that close. That's crazy.
Well, I think this statistic is a bit deceptive because there's a link to the article. Like within the article, there's a link. And it says like cumulative players, and both free and subscribers.
That's what I figured it was.
That's lead to me to believe that like if you add every person that has ever played Final Fantasy 14, then you get to 10 million. I believe that. But
which makes you realize how big WoW is, right? When they're getting subbed players.
Yes. If we're talking about just sub players, like concurrent sub players, I just don't believe that Final Fantasy ever had 14. Final Fantasy 14 ever had 10 million or even close to 10 million.
Well, they definitely don't now, because I just remembered. I have a terrible memory, but I remembered the last time I reported on them. They, in terms of active, meaning like played 30 hours within the last month, or I think it was like 20 hours within the last month. The highest number I've ever seen personally was like 1 million. That was the highest number I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously I haven't counted these players, so this is like there's a certain extent of speculation here. But if I were to estimate the amount of players playing Final Fantasy 14 concurrently, I would say it's like 750k to a mil. That's my estimation.
Well, based on their own statistics, that's probably true.
Yeah.
Because after Storm, what's that expansion called? It was Storm something.
Stormblood, yeah. I
Yeah.
actively play Final Fantasy 14 like every day.
During Stormblood, they had, or before it came out, they had like 700,000, and I think they got up to 1 mil after. So obviously, they've had another expansion, I think, since then.
No.
Yeah, no. But
Was that the
game's
most
doing
recent
quite
one?
well, actually. The Stormblood is the most recent one. Yeah, we are
Okay.
expecting the next expansion next summer.
Yeah, we're entering the end phases of Stormblood.
Yeah, so I mean, anyway, that's interesting to see. Obviously, a little bit of a shift in the market to some extent. Someone said that Heavensward was the last.
Heavensward was the one that came before Stormblood.
Oh yeah, okay. Here. Oh, well, I don't know. Pin Zero, you're confusing me in chat. Anyway, I think good discussion. Does anybody else have any other questions that they would like to ask? Anybody in chat, you can at me. Anybody wants to join Discord, or anybody currently in Discord have any questions or topics they would want to talk about? Maybe hot takes, maybe just things you're curious about. Because if not, that means it's time to say goodbye. I'm sure, Bacon says, sure glad these journalists are able to read and interpret data. Well, to be fair, I'm not clicking the link, but that's because I have everything on my screen meticulously like outlined to where I would have to alt tab and reset everything again. So that's why I haven't clicked the link. It's not because I don't trust the link. I don't think it's a virus or anything. To defend myself there. Bacon Knight.
I think that one of the biggest things WoW did was it did count the pre-orders of Battle for Azeroth a little on the high side, because a lot of times, because the pre-orders did add the access to the allied races, which everyone wanted.
Yeah, that's man, I could rant about that forever, and maybe I will to some extent. Looks like I don't have any other questions, so I'll probably finish the rest of the podcast by myself. So I'm thankful for you guys for communicating with me and talking about some of these topics and being by to watch the podcast.
Yep.
And if
just a side note, I linked a picture in Discord. This is from a Super Data Research, like the top 10 most earned, like the highest revenue by July to 2018. I thought this was like, since we're talking about the revenue and sub numbers, I thought it was kind of relevant.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured looking at this. I figured WoW was at least top 10 still at this point. They definitely make some serious money. But yeah, thanks for posting that. Okay, so we're reaching kind of the end of the podcast today. I didn't get as many questions today. I think we had our discussions and they were kind of all over the place. But one thing I wanted to mention a little bit is that as much as we talk about old hat MMO type shit, you have to understand that when the market is a certain way, it's that way for a reason. So like the market is the way it is now because, in my opinion, it was a natural progression for the market to go from being everything takes 10 hours to do content and you having these like Final Fantasy 11 raids that last like 25 minutes or whatever it is.
Shooting people, cracking wise, and pretending to know how to fight with my hands.
That sound is somebody just subbing to us. So thank you, Farrowin, for subbing. I appreciate your tier 1 sub. Welcome to the Nor Club, and hopefully that's one step closer to our sub goal of being an outfit so I can sweat my ass off. But at least I can do it in style. And with possibly a fedora, but I'm not sure yet if I'm actually going to be wearing one. Anyway, to finish kind of what I was saying, I think that as much as I talk about, back in my day, I want the market to move forward. And so, as I said, it most certainly had to move forward. Like we needed things to be more streamlined. We needed a better UI. We needed a better gameplay. It's just that along the way, people kind of realized, especially in a game that, as an MMO is so difficult to make first off, but is also just financially such a burden. There's not a whole lot of reason to take so much risk. And so that just, no, it's okay, Kindness, not derailing the topic. It's just that I think in the future, I won't bring everybody in at one time because what inevitably happens is discussion kind of gets derailed. But more so, I think people who watch the podcast and who listen to the podcast, they want to listen to me talk more. So I think I'll start bringing you guys in one at a time, so that way it's more contained and we can kind of stay on topic more. But look, we're figuring this out as we go, and I say we as in us, the community, but also me, the creator. And plus, it's all exciting. It's nice to have everybody on. And first off, people have been asking, and I should have said this in the very beginning, by the way, but I should have said this in the beginning that if people were wondering why we haven't had a guest yet, it's not because of lack of trying. I have reached out to people. Okay, it seems like people didn't mind it as much. Good. Thanks for the bit donation, by the way, Rainy Tide. But I have reached out to people, but they've just, unfortunately, they have real jobs. So if I were to do an episode with those people, one of them being Indigo Gaming and the other one being Fevir, sorry, who covers MMOs, mainly kind of like right now, I think he's covering Lost Ark a lot. These people have jobs, so unfortunately I would have to do like a Sunday podcast to have them on. But ultimately speaking, the podcast was never designed to be a two-person show necessarily. I wanted it to be able to succeed on its own, which is why I've structured it in the way that I've structured it. And I know this week was not as structured as it normally was, but I kind of chalked that up to like, I don't really put a whole lot of preparation into my podcast. I do it kind of sort of on the go. And so this time, I wasn't exactly sure what my point was halfway through making my own point. So I had to restate my point multiple times in the very beginning. But anyway, I've designed the show to be more about me interacting with the audience, right? And us having discussions. So whenever I say things, I want people in chat to feel like they can respond to it. And I mean actually respond to it in Discord. I kind of like the idea of my podcast being the place that everybody can kind of have an open forum for discussion, but also possibly maybe disagree with certain points that I've made in the past or whatever else. And this week, I think the thing that I'm most excited about is announcing the Telltale video. I'm really excited to do this video. Like I haven't been so pumped to do a video in probably a couple of months, but I'm really pumped to do this video because I know that other people are going to cover it, but they're not going to cover it like I cover it. And that's what I'm so excited for. Make a podcast text channel in Discord. I'll do that, Baconella. Or Baconite. Why do I always call you? Oh yeah, because that's your Twitch name. The reason why I don't make the text channel is because I prefer people would talk in Twitch chat. But at the same time, yeah, like I don't want too many places because then I have to read like 3 different chats. Whereas I can just read like on screen whenever one of you guys are asking a question. If we have questions, is Twitch chat a bad place? No, Twitch chat is actually the best place to ask, just because it's the one that I'm looking at the most. That's just simply because. Definitely prefer Twitch over Discord. Yeah, see, most people probably would because they can do it at work. They can listen to Twitch at work. So, again, next time we do the podcast, just feel free to @ me whenever you have a question. And if you have a question earlier in the week, I would write it down. Feel free to ask me next time you see me. The biggest thing that I wanted to do with the podcast was make myself more accessible, but also make myself let you guys know more about my personality. That's kind of why I've told a little bit about my interest in regards to figuring things out. You fall into that at work category. I totally understand. I've been that person before. But it's also, you have to be willing to have discussions because like no one person has all the answers. I don't have all the answers. I don't know exactly what the future is going to be. We're all speculating to some extent. It's just that I just so happen to spend a majority of my life playing MMOs and trying to understand them. So that's the only difference between me and the regular person is that I put a lot more time into thinking about it, I guess. And some of you guys love watching the podcast because you get to talk about these things that you pretty much never, ever get to talk about. The MMO market right now, we're not doing so hot. And I think it's so funny because when you look at podcasters or streamers, we don't have a lot of people. We don't have a lot of MMO streamers. Besides like the WoW streamer, like the WoW streamer is probably Asmongold, right? But we don't have a whole lot of like variety MMO streamers or variety MMO channels. They've kind of just fallen to the wayside as Fortnite and MOBAs and other things have kind of become that much more popular. It's funny right now. Don't you guys feel like we're on the fringe again? It almost feels like back in 2002 or 2003. It feels like we're right on the edge of like something is going to happen, but we don't know what yet. And if you guys are wondering why you never hear me talk more about the Kickstarter MMOs, it's because as I've mentioned before, there's not enough information yet that I can really have a good discussion Because if it's just like today, it was fun. We talked about Lord of the Rings. We talked about exploration. I like to call that just like brainstorming. We're all thinking. We don't know the answers. None of us know the answers. Otherwise, we would, create an MMO, or we would basically have videos that would prove that we know the answers. But like, we don't all know we're ultimately going to speculate based on whatever information we have or based on our perception of things. I wouldn't say we are on the fringe like 2003, but MMOs and their players are becoming a smaller group, I think. You don't feel that ambition? Well, I'm not trying to say that we're like, as a market on the whole, right at that point to where we have to innovate. I don't want to say we're there yet, but we certainly are a market that have realized an issue. You can read any MMO chat in current day, which, by the way, MMORPG subreddit is one of the most, like, in my opinion, one of the worst places to talk about MMOs, because it's a lot of bandwagon. It's a lot of, oh, this game sucks. Oh, this game sucks. Let's only talk about the popular games. It's a lot of Guild Wars 2 is the best MMO ever, and it's basically that's the majority of the discussion. Or it's, hey, let's look at this other shit game that came out. That's not really a good place for discussion. So I hope to breed more discussion with the podcast and with my Discord and with my community. I want us to discuss more things like why exploration doesn't work, if the market is going to advance right now. Do we need AAA MMO developers, or can we just rely on the indie ones? Are the indie ones going to be the ones that educate the AAA developers? Do we need these Kickstarter MMOs to work? Perhaps, if we want to have bigger MMO developers involved, is this new Lord of the Rings MMO going to be anything fun or exciting or different or new? We have no clue. We can all speculate, but I think the fun thing is that there's so much to talk about besides the current MMOs. So while we might not always talk about the current MMOs as much in terms of details, there's a lot to learn from them, and certainly a lot to talk about now. Someone in chat said Reddit people are weird. Weird. I don't think that they're weird per se. It's just that Reddit is inherently going to be bandwagon-y to some extent, right? Because it's like you're going to say a general thing and a bunch of people are going to upvote it. But you're never going to have to explain that, right? And that's the most important thing for me on my channel and my Discord, is that every statement that somebody makes, they have to quantify it. They have to explain it, right? Exactly. It's a bit of a hive mind, I would say, of subreddits to some extent. But they have to explain it. For example, the thing that I'll end this podcast with is the constant belief or the constant statement that people say, which is that because this hasn't worked, therefore it will never work. And just, first off, that's just not true. That's just not true. Sometimes things don't work because they're just not done right. And for some reason, MMO players don't seem to realize that, because I see them all the time, especially on MMORPG subreddit. Again, don't go to that subreddit. It's terrible. But anyway, I'm just kidding, kind of. But they say statements like, oh, anytime you introduce loot into an MMO, it's going to fail. It's like, well, not really. Well, anytime PvP is the major focus of an MMO, it's going to fail. Or group-based PvE content isn't going to work anymore. It's like, guys, good ideas. Like someone in chat just said, good ideas can have poor execution. Sometimes a movie, you watch it and you're like, that's a cool idea, but it's not very cohesive, right? Or sometimes you listen to an album and you're like, it's not really a cohesive project, but it's good songs, or it's okay, or I like the vision, or I like the idea, right? That's the thing that drives me crazy, is you have all of these experts who come into the, MMORPG discussion and they're just like, well, this hasn't worked in the past, therefore it's never going to work. It's like, well, look, the PvP discussion is one that I'll rant about forever, because I'm a PvP player, if you guys have never realized that. I've always been a PvP player, but I'm also a role player, which is like kind of where I confuse people, because they expect me to hate PvE, but I don't. I actually think PvE is very integral to roleplay. But it almost seems like this rhetoric where people just seem like they want to just all bash PvP. That's the strange thing to me, because it's like, look, guys, is when you look at a game like Dark Ages of Camelot, when you look at Warhammer Online, when you look at Darkfall Online, when you look at Shadowbane Online, when you look at these big, the most popular MMORPG experiences at their time for PvP, is PvP the main reason they failed? Be honest, right? You have to look at it holistically. You have to build a timeline of events, like I always say, or like Agatha Christie says, Poirot says in his in the novels. You have to build a timeline of events. And when you start to realize, like, there's all these other factors, can you honestly say as a whole that this one thing is the reason that this thing won't succeed? It's just too broad and too general and just frankly lazy of a statement. So can we stop with these, like, you know, big platitudes of saying things like all PvP MMOs fail, RP is pointless, there's no way they're ever going to do exploration, games will always be too easy. Those statements you can't quantify. You can't explain those. You can't even debate those. Because even just examining those questions or those statements with just a little bit of scrutiny, you realize there's no analysis there. It's just hive mind shit. It's just saying whatever is catchy and a bunch of people upvoting the same kind of shit. But at the end of the day, I ask you a simple question. If the reason that you say is the reason that a game doesn't succeed, could you argue that without that reason failing, that they would still succeed or wouldn't fail with all those other factors? Can you accurately take that one factor, isolate it, and compare it to these other factors? Let's look at Shadowbane, right? Can you say that Shadowbane was the biggest reason that the game failed? Or perhaps that they had a budget that was 1/10 the size of EverQuest, which, by the way, had a small budget comparatively to WoW and these other MMOs. You know what I'm saying? Can we accurately say that PvP is the only reason that it failed, is the significant reason? I think it has more to do with the fact that Shadowbane had a shitty engine, that they were a home-baked, developer company coming out of somebody's apartment, right? I think these are bigger factors. I think we can say this accurately, that these are bigger factors, right? When you look at Dark Ages of Camelot, same kind of difference, right? We can look at these other reasons for why they fail. And Darkfall Online, pretty much one of the first physics-based 3D MMORPG PvP experiences, a full loot game. Did it really fail because it had full loot, guys? No. Full loot was just a mere piece of the puzzle. Full loot was a mere piece of the puzzle that was expounded upon and made far worse by the bugs, by the rampant exploits, by the population getting whittled down by toxic and griefing players, hackers, that sort of thing. Like, it's just one piece of the puzzle. So my main point is that when you look at something just in general, whenever you're analyzing something, try and watch yourself from just saying statements or things that you can't quantify or explain. And that's what I dislike about the general analysis crew of the YouTube sphere or the Reddit sphere, is they're basically most interested in what is the most popular opinion. So it's kind of like, well, PvE MMOs are the most popular, right? So then therefore they're the best. It's like, well, not really. And they don't have to compete against each other. They have a far different audience. Why does it matter to you when one game is created for a certain kind of audience that doesn't matter to you at all? If you're not that audience, then don't play the game. The game's not made for you. But it drives me crazy, the amount of pompousness that I see whenever people are like, I would never play such a game that would have PvP. It's like, man. We as an MMORPG community in 2018, we are still so divided. We will always be divided because the thing that makes our games work the most is tribalism. And guess what separates people? Tribalism. It is funny to think about, though, especially when you think about the culture within certain games. Like, when you see this a lot, especially in my position, where you start to analyze games that are dying, that are right at that point, right before they die, like WildStar, for example. When you look at a game like that, you're just like, man, it's so right on the cusp, and there's so many signs that prove that, right? Like objective things, developers saying no new content, no new zones, them having issues and bugs with their whole Primal Matrix system, that being a whole flop in itself. You can point out all of these reasons, but for some people, as long as it's not literally dead, it doesn't need any further discussion. But thank God for this podcast. And thank God, or the fictional, for the, what do they call them? Paint? I'm trying to remember the, what's that name of that religion? I have to Google this. Pantheism for the pantheistic folk, for the atheistic folk, or for the religious folk. I'm just memeing. But anyway, yeah, flying spaghetti monster, pagans for all of you people out there. Sorry if I say on God. That's just a general statement that I make. But anyway. Yeah, MMOs do appeal to all kinds of people, and that's the great thing about them. But at the same time, it's just like, my main point is about analysis. Like, I'm so tired of seeing like people say it like they're making these statements like they're so educated and they're so, right. But these are just things that you can't quantify. If you can't explain your argument, if through further scrutiny your argument falls apart completely, it ain't really an argument. You're just saying something edgy, or you're just saying something that you think is true. And that's just the big thing that I try and push with my channel and with my community, is whenever you guys say something is wrong or bad, just know why. Or is it good? Why is it good? What reason particularly do you think makes it good or bad? And what you will find, in my opinion, is once you start to realize this, and once you start to adhere to this, your criticism becomes far more consistent, and it also becomes far more rational. Because ultimately speaking, if I get up here and I'm just always like, WoW sucks and I hate WoW because it's the most popular game and, screw everybody in the general public. I'm going to alienate a lot of people, but it's just not pleasant to hear. You don't want someone to constantly complain that MMOs suck right now and it's not fair. I'm sure there's many MMOs out there for you guys to try. Now, am I going to acknowledge that they might not be that different from each other? Probably. I will make that point. But my biggest point and biggest points are always going to be surrounding the idea of innovation. And that's that I refuse to believe that, like Ludens just said in chat, if we constantly appeal to the lowest common denominator, that means that we'll never have the cool, exciting shit that we want in our game. If you want an MMORPG, let alone MMO, if you want an MMORPG that really allows for character customization, that really allows for having a purpose, right? That really allows for a great deep level economy, crafting system, community interaction. If you want all of these sorts of things that many people talk about wanting, you can't just appeal to the lowest common denominator. So yes, from a business perspective, it makes sense. They're trying to cast a wide net as much as they possibly can. But ultimately speaking, we need those developers who are willing to just cast a small net, right? That small little net. Go after their little niche of an audience. And yeah, sure, they'll never reach the same levels of a Guild Wars 2 or an Elder Scrolls Online. But if they can reach 10,000 people, then maybe that's enough players within their own confines of their system to be functional. And that's the scary thing about sandbox games, right? Is that sandbox games need a certain amount of population. Did I not say small net? Sorry, I meant small net. Like sandbox games, unfortunately, they need a certain level of population. And you saw this in Darkfall Online. So Darkfall Online is one of my favorite MMOs of all time and is probably the most hardcore MMO, I would probably argue. But Darkfall had many, many issues. Not just PvP and not just the way that they implemented their... okay, I was just making sure, Spectrum. I was trying to make sure I didn't say anything wrong. But Darkfall is such an interesting case because they relaunched that game like 3 times. It still kept failing, but they kept relaunching it and it kept failing because they were never truly addressing the major issues. Which, first and foremost, is that if you're going to build a world that is totally based on community interaction and player interaction and PvP and all of this sort of thing, these factions and whatever else, if the map is too big and there's not enough population, it's just going to fail, right? It's just going to fail. Like it can't succeed. If the map is too big and there's not enough players, that's a terrible problem to have for a sandbox game. And that's why sandbox games are more risky. You can't afford to have a failure of a launch. You need a lot of players. You need people constantly pushing the market. People building more things in the economy. You need people getting angry at each other and creating feuds and war decking each other. and constantly having conflict, or you need new player experiences. You need clans that are willing to help out new players and whatever else. You really need all of these different types of experiences within an MMO. And at the end of the day, in a sandbox game, you can't have any of that without population. So it's sad to say, but I think that that's the biggest barrier behind a true sandbox experience, is that we're going to need enough players to sustain that ecosystem. If you think about a virtual world, right? A true virtual world where the AI to some extent is dynamic. Players are all their own roles. There's a farmer, there's a stable master, there's people who are building boats, there's people who are fishermen, the best fishermen, right? The top the top map surveyor or cartographer, like these different professions, I guess you would call them, right? Professions. These different professions, you need all of this within your virtual worlds, right? There needs to be somebody who's making the food, somebody who's making the drink, somebody who's making the mounts, the weapons, the ammo, the building the structures. You need somebody that's going to manage the towns, who's going to lead. It's a lot, right? That's asking a lot from your player base. That's why sandbox games are so rare and they're rarely done right. It asks a lot from your player base. But at the same time, that's what we want, right? We want that level of control and impact over our audience. We want the ability to be able to build this game and community that really makes it feel like we have another home away from home. And that was kind of the initial idea of the virtual world, was the idea that we could create this universe which is really lived in. It really has its own rules and systems, and whenever you're not in the world still goes on. It doesn't, like, think about the real world, right? People out there right now are driving their car. They're out there mowing their lawn or whatever else. Just because I'm not outside doesn't mean that the world doesn't exist. And that's kind of the weird thing about MMORPGs, is that they kind of like, they have this like, oh, we're another world, you can like be who you want to be, but it's like, not really, right? Not really. You're kind of like a pseudo world. In fact, under the weight of your own confines of like your system, your own rule set, your system kind of falls apart. And I'm talking about Elder Scrolls Online in particular. Yes, we're going overtime here a little bit, but I'm talking about Elder Scrolls Online in particular. I have my sights on you. And the reason why I pick on Elder Scrolls a lot is because within the own confines of their IP, their mythos, their background, or their lore, their own game doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that we have Dark Elves chilling around with High Elves, right? Why do we have Altmer and Dunmer just peacefully like chilling with each other? That's just not realistic at all. Like, why are the Nords hanging out with the Argonians? Why are the Argonians in the same party as Dark Elves or Dunmer? It doesn't make any sense from a lore perspective. Argonians raised Morrowind. Like, they ruined their, like, they killed their entire continent. Like, they ransacked it and like destroyed their capital cities and stuff. Like, why would the Dunmer be like, hey guys, no big deal, there's an Argonian in my party. Drama, lore, who cares of such things? Like, that's what drives me crazy about many of these worlds, is like, they try and communicate the idea that, oh, this is Elder Scrolls Online. This is the virtual world of Elder Scrolls Online. It's like, no, it isn't. You guys don't even believe that. Your own game doesn't believe that. Your own lore doesn't believe that. You contradict each other. You create this whole Tamriel Unlimited thing, where it's basically taking the whole idea of like, okay, here's all these factions that we created. Here's all these classes and stuff that are, you know, within certain factions, and these factions have these different, these different races have different factions. Ah, screw all of that. We're all the same now. That's what they did, by the way, and it was widely successful. That's the scary thing. Them completely abandoning their lore to some extent was like widely successful. It made the game, it basically saved the game in many ways. Now, I don't want to make that bold of a claim and say that it was the only reason that they started to do well. They also started to change the way that they structured their game. But think about it. Elder Scrolls wasn't doing so hot at first. But once they got rid of the whole idea that they initially were trying to do, which is like actually listen to their own idea of like their own lore and background, once they got rid of all of that and just said, let's just all do the same thing, it worked. But it works because it's ZeniMax. They have the money, they have the time, they have the effort. They can make it just about the general fun, right? They can make it just about how much fun can you fit in 2 hours. That's the idea behind games like Elder Scrolls and Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft and Guild Wars 2. How much fun can we fit in 2 hours? Like, can we make it to where this person wants to log in every day, even if they're just doing the same thing over and over again? Like, that's what they want. That's why they create these forms of progression and achievements and costumes and whatever else. It's just to kind of convince people that you matter, but you don't really, right? And look, once you guys realize this, now I've mentioned this before briefly, and I'll end the stream on this. Next time you guys play an MMORPG or an RPG, truthfully create your character in mind with this character that you're creating in the universe. Like if you're crafting a tabletop character, actually craft a character and actually try and apply him to the world in which you're playing in, right? Like actually try and understand the lore in which is presented to you. I don't know about you guys. I've tried that with games like Elder Scrolls, and immediately I have to log off because I realize this isn't Elder Scrolls. This is like the Elder Scrolls name, and it says Dunmer or Dark Elf, or it says Morrowind. But is it really? It's like it just doesn't follow. Like the lore itself contradicts each other. The world contradicts each other. Same thing with Lord of the Rings. Like you guys ever played Lord of the Rings online? It's like basically people will refer to it as a WoW clone. But it's very, very similar to WoW and not in good ways. It has very like rudimentary and kind of like basic gameplay. But if any of you guys have ever played Lord of the Rings online, it barely feels like a Lord of the Rings game. It's so constrained. It feels like in order to really let a game like that live, it has to be more expansive. It just has to be, right? I don't know about you guys, but whenever I think about the world of Lord of the Rings, I'm not imagining like the idea of like this super regimented world in which, oh, you only go to these certain zones and everyone sort of just works together and there's no PvP except if you're going to fight against the monsters because the free folk would never fight amongst each other. It's like, what? That doesn't even make any sense. Given your own lore, it doesn't make sense. The free folk fought amongst each other all the time. Also, orcs fought against each other all the time. Elves and dwarves fought against each other all the time. It shouldn't just be monochromatic like, we are all on the same faction because of the sake of the game. Like that's kind of like they go for these very robotic like lore approaches. And again, it's just not realistic. Like I'm not talking about a realism in the real world. I'm talking about realistic given its own kind of like confines of its own story, right? Isn't that game like split into those weird story expansion things? Yeah, basically Pin Zero, the way the Lord of the Rings online game works, and Lord of the Rings Online yell at people to kill them. The way that Lord of the Rings Online works is it's like there's new zones for each expansion, and those expansions are story content. So it's actually like there's some level of story content, and that's why the game has managed to exist this long, because they keep creating new story content that gets developed, which is actually cool because it follows Tolkien lore to some extent. But ultimately, it's not impactful in the same way, right? Because in the way that if you were to go to Mordor in a real, like, imagine you're in the Tolkien universe. If you were to waltz right into Mordor, one does not simply waltz into Mordor, right? I mean, that's a meme, but it's true. You wouldn't simply walk into Mordor and just be like chilling there, right? It wouldn't be it would be a terrifying experience, right? Or maybe even just like going to Rohan would seem like you're really going to Rohan. You see horses everywhere, like specific types of players and cities and the way things. I mean, they do an okay job with their hey yo, what's up, this Mordor. Nice memes, but anyway, I'm rambling at this point, so that's a good time as any to stop. But my main point is that my big problem with the majority of the like well-known IPs. When I say well-known IPs, I mean intellectual properties such as at this point, Warcraft is an IP, a very well-known one, right? We also have Lord of the Rings. We also have Star Wars. We also have Star Trek to some extent, lesser extent, because their MMO obviously isn't that popular. We have Elder Scrolls, and we have Final Fantasy. So these all of these universes are so cool, and these IPs are so great, but they're just like the MMOs to me. That's not what I had in mind when I thought about that game or that universe realized, right? Like, I don't know about you guys. Do you ever, like, maybe I'm the only guy who reads these days, but I like to read. And I love reading Tolkien, obviously, because Tolkien is one of the GOATs. But the best thing about Tolkien is that he took the time, painstaking details for every little bit of lore, and really tried to explain all the conflicts and everything. A game like Lord of the Rings Online, the one that currently exists, kind of takes all of that conflict and just like packages it up into like an easy to understand and easy to play format that basically doesn't do the universe any justice at all. And the same thing I say with Elder Scrolls Online. Have you guys ever played Morrowind? Have you ever played Daggerfall? To a lesser extent, have you ever played Oblivion? Now imagine those worlds with a massive multiplayer online game attached to it. It's different, right? It's pretty different. Like, you think about Morrowind, the MMO. It's like, wait a minute. Why does this seem more like an MMO than Elder Scrolls Online does? Well, that's kind of the problem. If Oblivion and Morrowind seem like they'd make better MMOs than TSO or TSO or TESO, whatever they want to call it, the Elder Scrolls Online, that's when you know you have a problem. And that shit, like, once I think about that, it just shatters my perspective and I can't play those games anymore. Because I'm just like, wait, how is Morrowind more of an MMO than Elder Scrolls Online is? Elder Scrolls Online, it's in the name. Anyway, that's a good time as any to stop the podcast. I want to thank everybody for stopping by. This week, we were very, very disorganized. We were all over the place. Topics were kind of not as structured as they normally are. I'm going to work on finding the balance between being fun, being open, being expressive, and having a little bit of structure so we can kind of follow some kind of tenets. So I'll work on that as the progress, or as the channel or podcast specifically progresses. But it's fun. I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching it live. For those who aren't watching it live, thank you for making it to the very end of this video, and thank you for watching the podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I'm Nerdslayer, your host. I'm out. I have nothing else to talk about. We went over a little bit, and I think people mostly enjoy that, so that was kind of cool. We got to speculate about Lord of the Rings Online. It's always cool to just like theory craft, isn't it? We don't get to theory craft that much these days because some of us just feel so shit when we theory craft. Because like, what's the point? They're not going to make the game that we want to make anyway, right? Well, the good news is we can still theory craft. We can still have fun with it, right? We can still imagine what the possibilities are of the future of the genre. That's still fun to do, and it will always be fun to do. So on that note, I will say goodbye to you guys, and yeah, peace. Where's my outro? Thank you for watching 6 Pixels Under, Episode 3.